The gaslight burned low along Park Lane that spring. A thin fog drifted in from Hyde Park, soft as breath. The trees stood black and still. Carriages rolled past the great stone houses, their wheels muffled on the wet road. Bells in the distance struck the hour. Mayfair in this year of 1872 was a place of velvet curtains and tall windows, of marble halls and silent servants, of money kept behind locked doors. At number 13, the lamps had been put out. The front steps were damp. The brass knocker shone faintly in the dark. A small dog whined somewhere inside the house. The kitchen had gone cold. The fire had not been lit. In the pantry, the door had been locked from the outside. A woman lay slumped against the wall, a rope still tight around her throat, her hands cold. The safe above her had been opened, then closed again. The banknotes were gone. The bonds were gone. The jewels remained untouched, as though they had been judged worthless. Outside, the city slept on. The fog thickened. The gas hissed softly in its globe. And in the morning, her daughter would come home. Chapter 1. A city lit by gas. Good evening and welcome. The night is quiet now and the world has grown small around you. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whether it is a bedroom in some tall and humming city, or a small house tucked into a quiet town, or a far place on the other side of the sea where the hours run differently from mine, let the time of night settle gently on your shoulders, and let the noise of the day fall away like ash drifting from a fire that has burned itself low. This is the Bedside Historian, and tonight, as the candle dips and the room grows still, we will drift backwards together through the long dim corridor of the years, into a London that is long since gone, into its fog and its lamplight, into its locked rooms and its quiet streets, into a story whose name was once whispered up and down the great houses of Mayfair, until the gas mantles burned down the great houses of Mayfair, until the gas mantles burned to nothing. If, before we begin, you would care to leave a small kindness to this little corner of the world, by tapping the like up on the screen, or by writing a soft word in the comments below to say where you are listening from and what hour the clock has reached in your home, or by following along so that future tales may find you again when the dark has need of telling. The channel grows by such small kindnesses, and the candle grow longer for the next listener who needs to be carried into sleep. The channel grows by such small kindnesses, and the candle may burn longer for the next listener who needs to be carried into sleep. Now, let us begin. The year is 1872. The kingdom is Britain, the city is London, and the season is the slow, uncertain spring of the late Victorian age. A spring that arrived in fits and starts that year, sliding in beneath low cloud and a long grey rain that fell on the slate roofs in a soft, steady murmur for days at a time. The Queen, dressed in the black she had worn for more than a decade since the death of her husband, kept to her rooms at Windsor and at Osborne, far from the capital, and her people went on without her, building and buying and selling and grieving and being born, in the great smoke-stained city that lay at the very centre of the world, for London in this year was the largest city the eye of mankind had ever beheld. More than 3 million souls lived within its bounds, crowded into the long, low brick streets that ran from the brown waters of the river outward to the green and uncertain edges of the country, where the new villas of the rising tradesfolk pressed against the last of the open fields. The streets ran on for miles, lined with chimneys lit at night by a slender forest of iron lampposts, each one tipped with a soft blue flame, and at every corner stood a watchman or a constable in his long blue coat, his bull's-eye lantern hanging at his belt, his measured step echoing on the wet stones long after the last carriage had gone. Above the city hung the fog. It came in from the marshes of the river, thick and yellow and sour with the smoke of the thousand coal fires, and it would not leave. By afternoon, when there was a sun at all, the sun became no more than a pale coin behind a veil of brown haze, and the gas mantles were lit early in the great houses and the small ones alike. By evening the air thickened until the man at the end of the street became only a shape, and his lantern only a glow, and the bells of the churches, when they rang the hour, sounded muffled, as though wrapped in cloth. The Londoners called this fog a pea souper, for the colour of it was the colour of cooked peas, and they had grown so used to it that they spoke of it the way country folk spoke of the weather, with neither surprise nor complaint. In the lungs of the old it gathered like a slow grey weight. In the throats of the young it left a soot that no washing could ever quite remove. On the worst nights it was said that a gentleman walking home from his club might lose his own street within 50 paces of his door, and that a cabman might drive his horse straight into the river without seeing the water until the cold of it rose around the wheels. And yet, for all of that, London was a city in love with itself. It was the heart of an empire upon which the sun was said never to set, and its money flowed inward from every corner of the globe, in long iron ships that came up the Thames laden with sugar and tea and cotton and silk, and the slow gleaning flesh of cattle in the holds of merchantmen that bore stones from India and timber from Canada and gold from the colonies of the south. The dots were forests of masts. The warehouses along the river ran for miles, their windows blank, their interiors stacked with the wealth of distant lands. By day, the great clerks of the city came to their counting houses in their tall black hats and their stiff white collars, and they wrote in their ledgers in long, careful columns of figures that grew, year upon year, as though there were no end to the rising of the world. But the city did not belong only to the men of the counting houses. It belonged also to the great families of the West End, who had built for themselves a country of their own among the parks and the squares of the central districts, where the air, though never clean, was at least cleaner than in the sooty east, where the houses, though never silent, were at least quieter than in the working streets, where the lives of the women and the men inside the tall stone walls were lived behind heavy curtains drawn against the gaze of strangers. Of all these districts, the most envied was Mayfair. It lay between Hyde Park to the west and Bond Street to the east, between the long green run of Piccadilly to the south and the genteel terraces of Marylebone to the north. And it had been, for 100 years and more, the chosen quarter of the great. Its streets were laid out in straight, clean lines. Its houses were of pale stone or of warm London brick, 4 stories tall, narrow at the front, deep at the back, with iron railings before the steps and iron lamps over the doors. Each house had its own bell-pull, its own brass knocker, polished daily by the housemaid, its own row of white-painted windows, and each, behind those windows, kept its own particular silences. In the basements of these houses, beneath the level of the street, lived the servants. There the kitchens lay, with their black ranges roaring through the long hours of the morning, and there the larders and the pantries opened off long stone-flagged passages, where the air was always cool, and there the bells, fixed to long wires that ran up through the walls of the house, hung in their ordered row that served the dining-room. Bell, the drawing-room bell, the bedroom bell, the drawing-room, the bedroom bell, the dressing-room bell. At each bell, labelled with the name of the room it served. The dining-room, the delight for a totem, the fanium. In the dining-rooms above, the families ate from china that came from the fine kilns of Staffordshire, and drank from cut glass that caught the gaslight, and wiped their lips upon white linen napkins that had been pressed by some unseen hand at 5 in the morning. In the drawing-rooms, the women sat at their pianofortes or their needlework or their letter-writing, and the men, when they were at home, sat with their newspapers and their cigars before the marble chimney-pieces. In the bedrooms above those, the great curtained beds stood like small ships at anchor, and the porcelain washstands gleamed faintly in the half-light, and the small clocks ticked softly through the long, slow nights of Mayfair. Of all the streets in this district, the grandest, perhaps, was Park Lane. It ran along the eastern edge of Hyde Park, from the great arch at the south to the grand terraces at the north, and on one side of it stood the iron rails of the park, with the long expanse of grass and trees beyond, and on the other side stood the row of tall, fine houses looking westward across the lawns. From the upper windows of these houses one could see the sun set behind the trees of the park each evening, and one could hear, on quiet nights, the soft hooves of the cavalry trotting along Rotten Row, and the distant cry of the swans upon the Serpentine, and the bell of the keeper as he closed the gates at dusk. It was an address that meant something. To live on Park Lane was to live in the very face of the world. To take a house there, even a small one, was to declare oneself a person of consequence, or, at the very least, a person who wished to be taken for one. The rents were high, and the leases were long, and the names upon the doors were the names of dukes and earls and bankers and the widows of admirals long dead. And yet in the same year, 1872, the row of houses upon Park Lane held also a small number of foreign tenants, French ladies in widow's black, Italian musicians who had come for the season. A Russian princess or two, for London in that year was a city full of foreigners. The recent war between France and Germany had broken Paris in half. The long siege had emptied the great boulevards. The rising of the Commune had set the city alight, and in the months that followed the fall of that brief republic, a long, slow tide of refugees had crossed the Channel and washed up upon the streets of Soho and Leicester Square and the genteel quarters beyond. Some came with money. Some came with none. Some came to be safe. Some came to be forgotten. The clubs of Pall Mall filled with French aristocrats in exile. The cheap lodgings of Soho filled with communards in flight from the firing squads. The kitchens and the laundries and the dressmakers' shops of the West End filled with French and Belgian women looking for work, and the great houses of Mayfair, in want of cooks and ladies' maids who could speak a refined tongue, took them in without too many questions, for there was no shortage of trouble in their old country, and a quiet woman with a steady hand was a steady hand, was a quiet woman with a steady hand, was a quiet woman with a steady hand, no matter what flag had flown over her birthplace. In the newspapers of that spring, the news of the world was reported in long, narrow columns. The Times, sober and grey, set down the comings and goings of ministers and the price of the great government bonds and the speeches of the bishops. The Daily Telegraph, more lively, gave its readers the latest from the law courts and the police courts and the inquest rooms, and below the news of these places, in smaller print, ran the advertisements for hair tonic and indigestion powders and the cures for ailments that polite people did not name. The Illustrated London News printed woodcut pictures of the Queen at Balmoral, and of fires in distant counties, and of ships lost upon the rocks. In the evenings, the boys ran through the streets crying the late editions, and gentlemen returning from their offices took up the papers and read them by the gas in their hansom cabs, as the horses trotted homeward through the fog. It was a world that believed itself solid. The Bank of England stood like a fortress at the heart of the city. The dome of St. Paul's rose above the rooftops in the east. The towers of the new Parliament rose above the river in the west. The Royal Standard flew, when the Queen was in residence, above the palace in the park. The gunboats of her navy rode at anchor in distant harbours. The trains of her railways ran on time. The clocks of her churches struck together upon the hour. The constables of her police walked their measured beats. And the gaslight, every evening as the dusk came down, was lit by quiet men with long poles, who moved from lamp to lamp through the streets, lifting the small flame to the glass globe and turning the brass key with a soft click. And the city, by some old ritual, was held safe against the dark for one more night. But within that safety, behind those polished doors, beneath those tall windows, in the basements where the bells hung in their rows and the bread cooled upon the stone, the lives of the people who lived in those houses went on as they had always gone on, in their loves and their quarrels, in their kindnesses and their cruelties, in their small angers that grew, year by year, into larger ones, and in their small silences that grew, year by year, into larger ones, and in their small silences that their ray learned to keep larger's license. And in the early hours before the watchman had called the last hour of the night, the city would begin again, the milk carts rattling down the cobbles in the dark before dawn, the chimney sweeps' boys creeping through the back areas with their bundles of brushes, the bakers stoking their ovens against the chill, the housemaids of the great houses rising in their cold attic rooms by the light of a single tallow candle to set the fires before their masters and mistresses had stirred. London woke not all at once, but slowly, district by district, basement by basement, lamp by lamp, until the great clock struck 6, and the curtains of the high windows were at last drawn back to admit the grey, returning light. The fog came down each evening. The lamps were lit. The carriages rolled home. The great doors closed. The bells were rung for supper. The plates were carried up the back stairs. The plates were carried down again. The fires were banked. The shutters were drawn. The clock struck 10, and then 11, and then midnight, and the watchman called the hour as they passed beneath the windows, and somewhere, in some quiet upstairs room of some quiet house upon some quiet street, a candle was put out, and the city slept, or seemed to sleep, beneath its blanket of yellow fog. Chapter 2. The Houses on Park Lane. To walk along Park Lane in the spring of 1872 was to walk along the very edge of two worlds. On one side lay the great green expanse of Hyde Park, with its iron rails, its long avenues of plane trees, its riders going up and down the soft sand of Rotten Row, and the slow silver flash of the Serpentine, with the swans gathered at the rushes in the long afternoons. On the other side lay the row of tall stone houses, looking out across the park, their high windows catching the late light, their iron lamps unlit until dusk, their pale stone fronts streaked here and there with the soot of the city, but never enough to spoil the dignity of the line they made along the road. The road itself ran for nearly a mile, north to south, along the eastern wall of the park. At its southern end stood the great arch through which the carriages of the gentry came and went, set down beneath the bronze statue of the late Duke of Wellington. The old soldier seated upon his horse, his cocked hat tipped slightly forward, looking down the long sweep of Piccadilly as though he were still watching for the troops to come up. At its northern end stood the Marble Arch, a pale, cold gateway carved with garlands and with trumpets, set down at the very corner where, 100 years before, the gallows of Tyburn had stood, and where the bones of hanged men had once whitened upon their gibbets in the days when the road was no road at all but a country track running across open ground. In the years between, much had been altered. The gallows had been pulled down. The waste ground had been built over. The track had been widened, paved and renamed, first Tyburn Lane and then, in the gentler fashion of a later age, Park Lane. The villas of the early 18th century had given way to the great terraces of the Regency, and those terraces in turn had been refronted and refaced and joined to one another until the eastern side of the road had become a long, almost unbroken parade of stone and stucco, of fine sash windows and ironwork, of doors with brass numbers and brass knockers and brass letter plates, polished daily by the housemaids who lived behind them. The houses were tall, 4 stories above the street, and a 5th half buried below. From the pavement, a flight of 3 or 4 white-painted steps rose to the front door, and from the front door, by way of a deep entrance hall paved in black and white marble, a wide staircase climbed up into the body of the house, where the great rooms of the family lay upon the first and second floors. Below the level of the street, a deep stone area opened beneath the railings, and from this area a narrow door led inward into the kitchen and the offices of the servants, so that the tradespeople, the milkman, the coal merchant, the boy with the ice and the man with the fish, all came and went unseen by the family above. In the early morning, when the gas was still burning blue in the lamps along the road, the carts of these tradespeople would come rumbling up Park Lane and stop, one after another, at the iron railings. The milk cart, with its great brass churns, the coal cart, with its men in soot-blackened sacks tipping the coals down a chute into the cellars below, the bread cart, the butcher's boy, the fishmonger's lad with his basket strapped to his shoulder. From the deep area below, the cook or the kitchen maid would come up to take the goods, the keys clinking at her waist, her white apron crisp, her hair drawn back beneath a plain linen cap, and she would count what was brought, and pay what was owed, and the cart would rumble on to the next house. And the cook would carry the day's provisions down into the cool, stone-flagged passage where the larders waited. Above her, the family slept on. Above her, the great curtained beds were still drawn close. Above her, the housemaid who had risen at 5 in the morning was already at work, on her hands and her knees upon the staircase, polishing the rods of brass that held the carpet to each step, dusting the picture frames in the long upper hall, drawing back the heavy velvet curtains in the drawing-room and laying the morning fire in the grate, all by the soft yellow light of the gas turned low. In the breakfast-room on the ground floor, the table was being laid for 9 o'clock, the silver coffee-pot, the rack of toast, the small white dishes of preserved fruit, the morning newspaper folded neatly beside the master's place. By 8:30, the hall clock was struck, and the family came down, and the day, in its decorous, unhurried way, began. By 10 in the morning the carriages were already moving up and down the road. The ladies of the great houses, in their riding habits of dark cloth, came out of their front doors with their grooms behind them, mounted their horses at the curb, and turned in at the gate of the park to take the morning ride along Rotten Row. The gentlemen more idly walked toward the clubs of Pall Mall or hailed a hansom cab from the rank at Hyde Park Corner. Children were brought out by their nurses, in long white aprons and tall straw bonnets, and led across to the park to feed the ducks at the Serpentine, or to watch the cavalry drilling on the open ground. The great park gates stood open. The bells of the cabs jingled. The horses' hooves rang upon the wet stones, and the houses watched, blank and silent, behind their drawn lace curtains. In the afternoon there were visits to be paid. A lady, dressed for the calling hour, would step into her carriage with the little silver case of her visiting cards in her hand, and she would be driven to the house of an acquaintance, where, if the lady of that house were not at home, the card would be left upon a small silver tray in the hall, with one corner turned down to show that the lady herself, and not a footman, had brought it. In this manner the polite world of London kept itself in motion, and the rules of who had called upon whom, and who had returned the call and who had not, were watched as carefully as the rise and fall of the great government bombs upon the floor of the stock exchange. The houses of Park Lane were, even by the high standards of Mayfair, expensive. Their leases changed hands for very large sums. The great families of the kingdom held some of them. Bankers held others. Lawyers and brewers and East India merchants and the makers of fortunes in railways and in cotton held still more. The names upon the doors changed, year by year, as some old line died out and some new one came up. And among these names, in this year of 1872, were a number of foreign ones, the names of Frenchmen and Italians and Russians who had taken houses in the West End either for the season or for some longer purpose of their own. Number 13 stood roughly halfway along the road on the eastern side, looking out across the iron rails of the park toward the trees. It was not the largest house upon Park Lane, nor the smallest. It was a narrow, four-storey house of pale stone, with a black painted front door, a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head, 3 white-painted steps, and a fanlight of cut glass above the door through which, of an evening, the light of the gas in the hall could be seen from the street. To either side of it stood houses very like itself, their fronts a little fresher or a little plainer, their windows a little wider or a little narrower, but each, in its essential bearing, the same pale, dignified front turned toward the park. Of all the foreign tenants upon Park Lane in this year, one was a Frenchwoman of middle age, a widow, who had taken the lease of number 13 some little time before, and who lived there with her grown daughter, a small white dog, and a household of 3 servants. Her name was upon the door. Her carriage stood, when needed, in the mews behind. Her bills were paid, the tradespeople said, on time. Her front step was scrubbed each morning. Her brass was polished. Her windows were clean. Her household was, by every outward sign that the eye of a passer-by could read, a household like any other upon that respectable, expensive, polite road. The black bombazine of her widow's gown was the only mourning the house wore, and in the evenings, when the gas was lit in her drawing-room above, the soft yellow glow showed only that someone within was at home, and that someone within was reading, or sewing, or writing letters, or simply sitting in the deep red plush of an armchair, watching the fire. Within, the house was divided in the manner of all such houses. The dining-room lay upon the ground floor behind a fine pair of mahogany doors. The drawing-room lay above it, upon the first floor, with 2 tall windows looking out across Park Lane to the trees. The bedrooms lay upon the second floor and the third. The servants slept in the small, plain rooms beneath the slates of the roof, where the dormer windows looked out upon the long row of chimneys, and where, on cold nights, the wind came in around the casements and rattled the loose panes of glass. Below the street, in the deep area, the kitchen lay along the front of the house, with the great black range against the back wall, and the long deal table running the length of the room, and the rows of copper pans hanging upon their hooks above the dresser. From the kitchen, a narrow, stone-flanked passage ran toward the back of the house, with doors opening from it to either side, the larder, where the cold meats and the bread and the cheeses were kept, the scullery, with its stone sink for the washing of the plates, the coal cellar, dark as pitch even at noon, where the sacks of coal were tipped down through the iron grating from the street above, and, at the end of the passage, the pantry. The pantry of a Park Lane house was not, as one might suppose, only a place for the keeping of food. It was also very often a small private office for the lady of the house, where the household accounts were kept, where the keys to the safes were hung, where the bills from the tradespeople were paid each Saturday, and where, behind a heavy iron door set into the wall, lay the small strong-box in which the cash and the bonds and the papers of the family were kept. The pantry could be locked from the inside or the outside. The key to it was carried upon the lady's chatelaine, and the room, when the key was turned and the lamp was put out, was as silent as a tomb. Behind the long row of houses, hidden from the eyes of the park, ran the mews. These were narrow cobbled lanes, lined with the carriage houses and the stables of the great families, where the coachmen lived above their horses, in small rooms reached by wooden ladders, and where, in the dim yellow light of the stable lamps, the grooms rubbed down the bays and the chestnuts, and the matched greys at the end of each long day. The mews smelled of straw, and of leather, and of horse, and of the warm breath of the animals through the long, slow nights. Children of the coachmen played in the lanes between the carriage wheels in the bright afternoons. The wives of the grooms hung their washing along lines stretched between the upper windows, and from the mews, by a narrow gate, One could pass through a door in the back of the great house, into the kitchen yard, where the dustbins stood in a row beneath a wooden roof, and where, on hot summer evenings, the kitchen maid brought out a chair and a pail of peas to shell while the long light fell. This was the pattern of every house upon Park Lane. The family above, the servants below, the bells in their rows along the kitchen wall, ringing now from this room, now from that, the morning's bread cooling upon the larder shelf, the afternoon's fire being lit in the drawing-room grate, the evening's candle being carried up the back stairs to the master's bedroom, and outside, in the road, the long, slow rhythm of the carriages, the riders, the walkers, the carts of the tradespeople, going and coming as they had gone and come for 100 years. In the spring of 1872, the road was as it had always been. The trees of the park were coming into leaf. The riders were already up early upon Rotten Row. The carriages of the gentry rolled out at 11 o'clock, and rolled in again at 4:30, in time for tea. The bells of the houses rang for the second post at 6. The lamp-lighters came along at 7:30 with their long poles, and one by one, all the way up the eastern side of the road. The gas lamps came alive, blue at first and then yellow in their tall iron stems. The shutters were drawn. The curtains were drawn. The front doors were closed against the night. And behind those doors, in those tall, narrow, polite houses, the long evening of Mayfair began. A traveller standing upon the corner of Hyde Park, watching the lamps come up along Park Lane in the dusk, would have seen no sign of trouble in any of those houses. He would have seen only the soft glow of fanlights, the moving shadow of a footman crossing a hall, the brief gleam of a chandelier as some upstairs door was opened and closed. He would have seen the same row of pale stone fronts, the same iron railings, the same brass numbers upon the same black-painted doors. Number 11, number 12, number 13, number 14, each one a little world of its own, each one closed. And the night came down upon the lane, and the lamps burned steady in the slow drift of the fog, and the houses of Park Lane settled into their long silence, the way they had settled into it every night for 100 years. Chapter 3. The widow from Rue Lafitte, Paris, in the years before the Empire was made, was a city in the slow, uncertain breath between two upheavals. The great fire of the Revolution had cooled. The ash of the First Empire had settled. The king who reigned upon the throne, the elderly Charles X, sat uneasy in the Tuileries Palace, and the grey rain fell upon the slate roofs and the cobbled streets and the long, uneven runs of the old quarters, where the houses leaned together over the narrow lanes and the smoke of 100,000 small fires went up into the pale grey sky. It was a city, still, of the old shape. The great boulevards that the next emperor would slice through it like the cut of a long sabre had not yet been imagined. The wide avenues, the gas lamps in their tall iron stems, the bridges of new white stone, the railway stations at the gates, the iron benches set down beneath the trimmed plane trees of the new public gardens, all of these belonged to a Paris not yet built. The Paris of these years was the Paris of the medieval lanes, of the bookstalls along the Seine, of the open-air markets where the country women came in at dawn with their baskets of cheese and apples upon their heads, of the thin, twisting streets that ran between the monasteries and the workshops of the artisans, and of the long stone quays where the boats from upriver unloaded the wheat and the wine and the firewood for the cold months ahead. Into this city, in or about the year 1826, was born a child to a respectable, careful family of small trade. Her mother and her father, of whom the records have very little to say, had made their living, as so many Parisians of their station had done before them, by some quiet labour with the hands and the eyes. The girl was, in the manner of the time, christened in her father's parish church and entered upon the rolls of her quarter, and her name, taken down upon the parish book and afterward upon the great civil registers of the city, was Marie Caroline Besson. She was raised from her earliest years in the long, slow rhythms of a Paris that had not yet been broken open. What kind of childhood was hers? The records do not now keep. She was a girl of her quarter, and she would have grown up in the small streets where the air smelled of bread, baking in the dark of the ovens, and of the wood smoke that rose from 1,000 small grates in the cold months, and of the strong, sweet tang of the horse drubbings upon the cobbles. She would have known the bells of her parish church, the cries of the chestnut sellers upon the street corners in autumn, the clatter of the barges along the Seine, and the great press of the city upon a saint's day, when the bells of every church in every quarter rang at once, and the shops put up their shutters at noon. She would have seen, in her early years, the slow change of one king for another upon the throne, and she would have heard, as a young woman, the cannon of the rising of '48 in the streets of her own city, when the king who had reigned in her childhood was at last driven from the Tuileries and the Second Republic was declared in the squares. She was a girl, and the world she came into was a world that had narrow paths for the daughters of small tradesmen. She might marry. She might keep a shop. She might enter into service in some great house. She might learn with patient fingers and a needle one of the trades of the milliners, the dressmakers, the embroiderers, the trimmers of bonnets and the makers of veils, that crowded the upper stories of the houses behind the Rue Saint-Honoré and the Rue de la Paix and the Rue de Lafitte, and that supplied the great ladies of the city with the small, expensive ornaments by which a woman of fashion was known. The Rue Lafitte, in those years, was a street of bankers. It ran in a long, straight line from the church of Notre Dame de Nort in the north, down to the great Boulevard des Italiens in the south, and along its length, behind the tall windows of its townhouses and at the back of its courtyards, lay the offices of the banking families who had risen in the years of the First Empire and the Restoration. The Rothschilds had their bank in this street. So had the Laffittes themselves, who had given the street its name. The carriages of the bankers came and went. The great doors closed behind them. The gas lamps were lit at evening, and the small shops along the street served the wives and the daughters of these men, and the wives and the daughters of all the other men who came on business to their counters. It was upon this street in time that the young Marie Caroline Besson made her place. The records give her the name of milliner. The accounts of the gossip press of a later year would give her the name of modist, which was a finer word for the same trade, and would speak of her shop as a small, expensive salon hung with mirrors and with silk, where the great ladies of the Second Empire were said, by these papers, to have come, and to have ordered the hats and the bonnets that they wore to the opera and to the long carriage promenades along the Bois de Boulogne. How much of that account is true and how much of it is the small, breathless invention of the boulevard newspapers will never now be known. But it is recorded, and seems to be the case, that her shop did at one time stand upon the Rue Lafitte, and that her customers were drawn from the better quarters of the city, and that the names of one or two among them, including, by the report of the same gossip papers, the name of a famous courtesan of the time, and the name, more astonishing still, of the wandering Empress of Austria, was sometimes set down beside her own, and a name, more astonishing still, of the wandering Empress of Austria, was sometimes set down beside her own. Whether the great ladies came up the small stair to her workroom in person, or whether the orders came through the hands of their ladies' maids, is a matter for the imagination only. In the 1840s, while her shop was beginning its slow rise, she met and married a man some little older than herself, by the name of Jules Recherche Riel. Of him the records have, again, only a little to say. He is set down in some places as a merchant, in others as a commissionaire, that is to say, a man who arranges the buying and the selling of goods upon behalf of others. The marriage was the second of his life, the first wife having died in some private grief of which we do not know the cause. From the second marriage, in the spring of 1847, was born a daughter, a small dark-haired girl, who was given, after the manner of the family, the names Caroline Julie, and who was, from her earliest years, called by her family by the second of her two names. The little family kept its house in Paris through the long, prosperous middle years of the Second Empire. The husband went about his business, the wife went about hers, the daughter grew. The shop in the Rue Lafitte became a small concern of some standing, with its own clientele and its own rhythms, and the takings of it, year by year, grew steadily. There were, by the gossip of the boulevards, certain other matters in the life of the lady of the shop, certain attachments, certain protectors among the gentlemen of the better clubs of the city, certain unexplained additions to her bank account. But the boulevards, then as now, were not always to be trusted, and the household, by the evidence of the parish books and the public registers, presented to the world the proper face of a respectable bourgeois family in the rising flood of the imperial age. At some point in the 1850s, the husband died. The records of his death are not clear at this distance. The widow took up the running of her own affairs, with her young daughter beside her, and she continued the trade upon the Rue Lafitte for some years more. In the year 1866, by an entry in a journal of the trade of that year, she sold the salon at the Rue Lafitte for the sum of 45,000 francs. It was a considerable price. With the money she went on to live, by all accounts, more comfortably than she had ever lived, and she gave herself, in the years that followed, to the preparation of her young daughter for a life upon the stage. The girl was, by the testimony of those who saw her at this time, a beauty of the dark and quiet sort, with a low voice, a gift for declamation, and a face that the boulevard photographers would soon think worth the trouble of their cameras. But the years that followed the sale of the salon were not easy years for any Parisian. In the summer of 1870, the Emperor Louis Napoleon, growing old and tired and ill in his palaces, declared war upon the King of Prussia. By the autumn, the Emperor was a prisoner, the Empire was no more, and the army of the Prussians was at the gates of the city. The long siege began. Through the cold winter of that year, Paris ate her horses, and then her cats, and then her dogs, and then the small birds of her parks, while the shells of the besieging army came over the walls and burst in the gardens and in the streets and upon the roofs of the houses. The cold was cruel. The bread was black. The dead lay in the cellars until the spring, and the widow Riel, in her flat or in her small house in the city, lived through the long winter of that siege, as the rest of the Parisians lived through it. She queued at the bread shop in the bitter mornings. She watched the price of an egg rise by some accounts to almost a louis. She heard at evening the heavy thump of the Prussian guns from beyond the walls, and the answering crack of the French batteries from the heights of Mont Valérien. She saw the gas lamps go out upon the boulevards, for there was no coal to make the gas. She saw the trees of the parks felled for firewood. She saw the great elephants of the zoo, killed and sold by the pound to the butchers of the better streets, who served the meat at very high prices to those who could still pay. By the spring of 71, when the Commune rose, and the streets of the city were once again red with the blood of fighting men, she had had enough of Paris. She gathered what she had. She took her daughter by the hand, and she made for the railway station, and the boat train, and the long grey sea. By the time the city had given itself up to the enemy, and the brief bloody rising of the Commune that followed had been put down with the firing squads of May, a great many of the better-off Parisians who could afford the journey had crossed the Channel and made their way to the safer ground of London. Among them, in the months that followed, was the widow Riel, with her grown daughter, with the proceeds of the sale of the salon still kept in bonds and in cash, and with such a few belongings as a Parisian lady of her standing thought worth bringing. In London she took, at length, the lease of a house upon Park Lane, number 13, and she set up there, upon a quieter and a safer scale than the salon of her younger years, a small, careful establishment of her own. Her daughter, who had by now learned her trade as an actress, joined a French troupe playing the spring season at one of the great theatres of the West End. The mother kept the house, the daughter kept the stage, and the household, upon Park Lane, settled into its uneasy peace. The setting up of the house at number 13 took some weeks. There was the lease to be signed. There was the furniture to be bought, in part from the auction rooms of the West End, and in part shipped from the small Paris apartments she had left behind. There were the servants to be engaged, by the slow back and forth of advertisements in the morning papers and inquiries at the agencies in Soho. A cook was needed, and a housemaid, and a parlour-maid, and a coachman to attend the small carriage that the mistress would keep at the mews behind the lane. The cook, in the careful French manner, was to speak French, for the mistress would have her dishes prepared in the manner of her own country. The housemaid, by the more usual English custom, was to be English, for the silver and the brass and the carpets and the fires of an English house were to be kept in the English way. The parlour-maid was to bring up the morning chocolate, the afternoon tea, and the evening supper. And so the household was made. There were rumours. There were always rumours. It was said, by the more ill-natured of the French papers at home, that the lease of number 13 had been paid for, in part or in whole, by an English nobleman of considerable years, an old soldier whose name was known to every reader of the dispatches from the Crimea, and that this nobleman, the Earl of Lucan, was either an attachment of the widow's own, or, more probably, of the daughter's. Whether this was true in the manner that the gossip press intended it to be true, or whether it was merely the kind of polite arrangement that is often, in cities of high rents and small incomes, kept respectable women in respectable rooms, is, again, a matter that the records do not finally settle. Lord Lucan, when he came to be questioned in the open court the following year, would admit only that he had at one time given the widow a sum of money in the form of a cashed bill, and would say no more. The widow herself, in this winter and spring of her London life, dressed each morning in the bombazine of her widow's mourning, settled the accounts of her small household with a sharp eye, kept her keys upon her chatelaine, and ruled her 3 servants with a temper that was sometimes, in the language of those who knew her, quick. She was, by the accounts of those who saw her, a woman of middle height, somewhat stout, with the dark eyes of her kind, and with the manner of one who had risen in the world by her own labour and was not inclined to forget it. She was 46 years of age, and in the long foggy evenings of Mayfair, when the gas was lit in the rooms of her house upon Park Lane, she sat by the fire in her drawing-room, with her small white dog at her feet, and she opened her account-book, and she wrote, in the small tight hand of a Parisian shopkeeper, the figures of the day. The fire burned low. The clock upon the chimney-piece ticked steadily on, and the long evening drew over the house, and over the lane, and over the park beyond. Chapter 4. The Daughter on the Stage. The London theatres in the spring of 1872 were lit by gas. Along the great cornices, and within the glass globes of the chandeliers, behind the painted draperies of the proscenium, and in the long low row of foot-lamps that burned upon the lip of the stage, the soft yellow flame of coal gas hissed and trembled, casting a warm, uneven, bolo gas hissed and trembled, casting a warm, uneven, almost living light over the painted backdrops and the powdered faces of the players. The light, in those years before the cold electric arc had reached the playhouses, gave the stage a quality that could not be reproduced by any later means. A slight, breathing, restless yellow that flickered across the faces of the actors as they moved, that softened every line of their makeup, and that made every long velvet costume seem to glow from within. The audiences who gathered evening upon evening in the stalls and the boxes and the high galleries of these theatres were of every kind. There were the gentlemen of the West End in their black evening coats and their white waistcoats, with their opera glasses upon their knees and their gold watch chains across their fronts. There were the ladies of the great houses, in long silk gowns of cream and lavender and pearl grey, with the white feathers nodding in their hair and the small fans of carved ivory at their wrists. There were the bankers and the lawyers and the foreign visitors and the literary gentlemen of draught. There were together under the soft yellow light, all murmuring together in the tree-stunts and the great curtains crampons that represented the theatres of the West End were many. Drury Lane held its long red velvet seats and its painted ceiling at the eastern end of Covent Garden. The Lyceum stood near the Strand, its tall portico looking out upon the wet stones of Wellington Street. The Haymarket, the Adelphi, the Princesses, the Olympic, each had its own following, each its own line of plays, each its own particular shade of gentility or of low pleasure, and each in its own way drew the crowds of London out into the foggy evenings to sit and to watch and to applaud. But for the foreigners of London, and for that part of polite society that took its pride in following the latest fashion of the Paris boulevards, the theatre that mattered above all others, in the spring of 1872, was the St. James's, on King Street, just off St. James's Square. Only a short walk from Pall Mall, and from the great clubs of the gentlemen. The St. James's was not, by the standard of the great houses of London, a particularly grand theatre. It was a small, neat, well-kept house with a circle, a gallery, and a parterre, and with a stage upon which a French company that spring was playing the comedies and the dramas of the modern Parisian boulevards in the original French, before audiences who paid for the privilege of hearing them. The company was a French one in every respect. Its manager was a man by the name of Raphael Felix, the brother of the great tragedian Rachel, who had died some 15 years before. Around him he had gathered, for the season, a troupe of actresses and actors drawn from the lesser stages of Paris, who had come over in their dozens upon the boat train at the beginning of the spring, with their costumes packed in their long wicker hampers and their little dogs in their cane baskets. Their plays were the modern plays of Paris. Frou-Frou, La Camaraderie, La Fiamina, Christiane, and the rest of the long, brisk, fashionable repertoire of the boulevards, and their performances were attended with great regularity by every Frenchman in London who could afford the price of a stall, and by every Englishwoman of fashion who wished to be thought to understand the language of Paris. The St. James's itself, when one came to it from the wet pavement of King Street, presented a quiet, almost domestic face. Its facade was of pale stucco. Its lamps above the door were of old polished brass. Within, the entrance hall was small and warm, with red carpet upon the floor and gilded mirrors upon the walls, and from this hall, by way of a low double door, one passed into the body of the theatre itself. where the parterre, the dress circle, and the upper gallery rose one above the other in the old shape of an English playhouse. The boxes, upon either side of the proscenium, were hung with curtains of crimson plush, looped back with cords of gold. The chairs of the dress circle were of red velvet upon iron frames. The great chandelier above the centre of the auditorium hung from the painted ceiling upon a long brass chain, and was lit, every evening before the rising of the curtain, by a man with a long brass pole who reached up among its glass globes and turned each gascock in its slow, careful turn. By a man with a long brass pole who reached up among its gikes with the larks. Among the young actresses of the troupe was a slim, dark-haired Parisian of 25, whose name upon the playbills was set down as Mademoiselle Riel. She was the daughter of the widow at number 13 Park Lane, and she had been brought up to her trade with care. She had begun, by the testimony of those who had known her in Paris, with the small parts and the secondary roles that fall to a young actress in her first seasons. She had moved, by degrees, to the leading parts of the lighter pieces. She had a good voice, a quiet manner, a face that read well from the third row of the stalls, and a name that, while it had not yet attached itself to any single great success, was beginning to be known among the smaller circles that watched the French theatre in London. The St. James's playbills of the season name her in several roles. She played the Baraine in Frou Frou, that being the modern comedy of Henri Meilhac and Ludovic Halévy that had taken Paris by storm only 2 or 3 years before, and that was now sweeping through the polite drawing-rooms of London, and the title part in Christiane, and Agathe in La Camaraderie, and Laure in La Fiamina. The notices that the morning papers gave her were, by the modest standard of these notices, kind. She was praised for the softness of her voice. She was praised for the truth of her gestures. She was not, by any of these notices, declared a great star, but she was a competent, careful, and well-liked young actress at the beginning of what might have been a long career. On a typical evening of that season, the carriages began to draw up at the door of the theatre by 7:30. The footmen in their long greatcoats stood beside the curb in the cold air, opening the doors of the broughams and the landauls that came up one after another from the dark streets, and handing down the ladies in their long silk gowns, and the gentlemen in their black evening coats. The pavement glittered with the wet of the spring rain. The lamp above the door burned its soft, even flame. Within, the audience filled the stalls and the boxes. The murmur of low conversation rose and fell beneath the painted ceiling, and at 5 minutes before 8 o'clock the orchestra below the stage struck up its first slow chord. The lights were turned down in the chandelier. The curtain trembled, and the play in its old rehearsed, candle-warmed motion began. Behind the velvet curtain, the world of the actress in those years was a world of long, hard hours and of small, careful economies. The day began for an actress in a London company, late in the morning, when she rose in her lodgings or in her own home and went down to her tea and her bread and butter. By midday she was at the theatre, where the rehearsals of the next week's piece went on for 3 or 4 hours, with the manager pacing the stage, the prompter at his small wooden desk in the wings, and the company gathered in their day clothes upon the boards. By 5:30 she was back at her lodgings, where she took a small supper of cold meat and tea, and where she began, by the light of a candle or of a single gas jet, the slow business of dressing for the evening. The lacing of her stays, the setting of her hair, the careful application of the white powder, the rouge and the kohl that the gas of the foot-lamps required. By 7 she was back at the theatre. By 7:30 the orchestra had begun to play. By 8 the curtain had risen, and by 11:30, when the gas had been turned down in the great chandelier and the audience had filed out into the wet streets, she came down at last by the stage door at the back of the building, with her cloak about her shoulders, and stepped into a hansom cab to be carried home. For Mademoiselle Riel, home was the small, dignified house upon Park Lane, where the lamp burned in the fanlight above the front door until she had returned, and where the housemaid, drowsy at the head of the back stairs, listened for her step upon the marble of the hall. She would let herself in with her own key. She would put off her wet cloak in the hall. She would climb, by the soft yellow light of the gas turned low, the long staircase to the upper floor, where her bedroom looked out across the iron rails of the park toward the dark trees beyond, and there she would sit at her small writing desk for a quarter of an hour or more, reading the letters of the day, before she put out the lamp and lay down at last to sleep. Among the names that appeared in those letters, in the spring of 1872, was the name of an English nobleman of very advanced years, the Earl of Lucan, George Charles Bingham, was at this date 72 years of age. He had served his country in his youth in the cavalry. He had ordered in middle age the famous and unhappy charge of the Light Brigade upon the Russian guns at Balaclava. He had returned from the Crimea to a long, cold quarrel with the rest of the army over his conduct upon that field, and had spent the years since in his houses in Mayfair, in the running of his estates in Ireland, and in the slow, deliberate writing of his memoirs. He was, by every account, a stiff, proud old soldier. He had a wife. He had a grown family. And he had also, by the gossip of those who knew him, a long-standing attachment to the household at number 13 Park Lane. What the precise nature of this attachment was, the open court of the law would, when the hour came, have some careful difficulty in deciding. It was variously rumoured in the morning papers of London and Paris that he was the protector of the widow herself, and that he had paid for the lease of her house in part or in whole. It was rumoured more quietly that he was the protector of the daughter, and that the widow upon Park Lane was, by some delicate arrangement of the kind that the polite world did not name, the chaperone of the young actress whose company he sought. Lord Lucan, when at last he came to give his evidence at the Old Bailey, would admit only that he had once, at her request, cashed a bill for the widow Riel in the sum of several £100, and that he had had no other dealings of an improper kind with either lady of the house. The court would not press him further. The matter would be closed. But for the moment, in this spring of 1872, the daughter at number 13 Park Lane went each evening to the theatre, and came home each midnight by hansom cab, and the small white dog of the household met her at the door, and the gas burned low in the upper hall. The repertoire of the season ran on. The notices in the morning papers were kind. The orchestra at the St. James's tuned its instruments. The audience filled the stalls and the boxes, and the great curtain rose, and the great curtain fell, evening after evening, upon the lit, painted, gas-warmed world of the London playhouses. Toward the end of the month of March, the season at the St. James's gave its actresses a few days of rest. Mademoiselle Riel, like several of her fellow players, took the opportunity to cross over to Paris by the boat train to see her old friends, to walk along the Seine in the soft spring weather of her own country, to call upon her old teachers and her old companions of the early stage. She left her mother in London, in the house upon Park Lane, with the housemaid, the cook, and the small white dog. She took with her only a small trunk of her clothes, a little leather case of her papers, and the address of the lodgings where she meant to stay in Paris. Victoria Station, when she reached it that evening, was full of the long whistles of the engines and the sharp ring of the porters' bells. The great glass roof rose above her in the gathering dark. The gas lamps along the platforms threw their long yellow circles upon the wet stones. The porters in their blue coats moved between the carriages with the trunks and the hat boxes of the travellers piled upon their barrows. She found her carriage. She paid her porter. She took her seat by the window. The whistle blew. The doors slammed shut, one after another, along the long line of the train, and with a slow rising shudder, the engine pulled away from the platform and began the long run southward through the dark, fog-bound country, to the sea. The boat train carried her down to Folkestone in the late hours of the night. The boat carried her across the grey channel through the early hours of the morning, and by the next afternoon she was in Paris, in the city of her birth, walking the streets of her childhood, where the chestnut trees were coming into leaf upon the boulevards, and the great glass windows of the cafes were beginning to be opened to the soft spring air. Behind her, in London, the gas burned in the lamp of the hall. The fire burned low in the drawing-room grate. The widow at number 13 Park Lane sat at her account book by the fire, with the small dog at her feet, and the house in the long, slow way of the houses of Mayfair settled into its quiet. The clock upon the chimney-piece struck 11. The housemaid put up the shutters of the windows that looked upon the park. The cook drew the bolt across the kitchen door, and the night drew slowly down upon the long dark line of Park Lane. Chapter 5. The cook from the burning city Belgium, in the years of her birth, was a young kingdom of old land. It had broken away from the Netherlands only a little more than a decade before, in the brief brave revolution of 1830, and it had taken for itself a king of its own choosing, and a flag of its own colours, and a place at the table of Europe. But the towns of it, the villages of it, The long forests and the slow, quiet rivers of it were the same towns and villages and forests and rivers that had stood there for 1,000 years since the time of the old monks who had cleared the trees to plant the corn and to build the small stone churches whose mounds in the south of this kingdom, where the hills rolled gently down toward the long border with France, lay a country called the Gaume. It was a country of pale yellow farmhouses set among orchards, of low, rounded hills covered with dark, dense forest, of slow streams that ran through meadows of clover and of wild flowers in the long days of summer, of small grey stone churches with red-tiled roofs, whose bells were the loudest sound that the country ever heard. The roads of the Gaume were narrow and winding. The villages were small. The names of them, Verton, Géraville, Chigny, Florenville, were the names of places that had stood, in much the same shape, for the better part of 1,000 years. The people of the Gaume were French in speech, Catholic in faith, and poor in pocket. They worked the small farms that had been worked by their fathers and their grandfathers and their great-grandfathers. They tended the cattle in the meadows and the pigs in the woods. They cut the firewood from the forests and stacked it under the eaves of their farmhouses for the long, cold winters of those low hills. They went to Mass on Sundays at the little stone churches in their best black coats and their starched white caps, and they did not, for the most part, travel far from the parishes in which they were born. But for the daughters of the small farmers, the path of life was a path that often led, sooner or later, away from home. There were too many mouths upon a small farm. The dowries that a peasant family could give to its girls were small. The boys, when they came of age, took up the plough or the axe. The girls, when they came of age, were sent out, by their fathers and their mothers, to find work as servants in the towns. They went in their plain dresses and with their few belongings tied up in a square of cloth to the larger market towns of the region, to Verton, to Arles, to Luxembourg, and from there, often by the long slow trains of the new railway lines, to Paris, where the great houses of the city had a long-standing fondness for the calm, careful, well-spoken servants of the Belgian Catholic country. Among these daughters, in or about the year 1842, there was born to a small farming family of the Gaume, a girl named Marguerite. The records of her early life are scant, as the records of all such girls were scant. She was christened in some small parish church. She was raised among her brothers and her sisters upon some small piece of land. She learned to cook, to wash, to mend, to keep a kitchen, to mind a fire, to bring up the milk from the byre at dawn, and to put up the shutters of the farmhouse against the long cold winds that came in off the forest at night. She was, by the testimony of those who knew her in her later years, a powerful, well-built, broad-shouldered young woman, somewhat tall for her sex, with a fresh, rough complexion, dark hair, and brown eyes that did not, when they fell upon a stranger, fall easily away. By her late teens she had taken the road that so many girls of her country took. She entered into service in a household in the French town of Verdun, which lies a little way across the border, in the long, low country of the Meuse. She kept that place for some years as a careful and a quiet servant. Her wages were small, her hours were long, her holidays were few. But the life of a respectable servant in a respectable French house was, by the standards of the country girls of the Gaume, a life of some advancement, and she remained in that place until, by the slow workings of fortune, she at length made her way to Paris. Of her years in Paris before the war, the records have very little to say. She would have lived in some small attic room, somewhere in the eastern districts of the city, where the rents were cheap and the air was thick with the smoke of the small workshops below. She would have worked in the kitchen of some house or some restaurant or some boarding place, learning, by the slow watching of the cooks above her, the long and careful art of the Parisian table, the soups, the sauces, the slow-roasted joints, the little tarts of fruit that came at the end of the meal, the careful placing of the parsley upon the plate. She would have walked, on her free Sundays, in the new public gardens that the Emperor had laid out, and she would have stood, with the rest of her countrywomen, at the back of the church on a saint's day, watching the candles upon the altar. And then, in the summer of 1870, the war came. The Emperor declared his war upon the King of Prussia in July. By August, the French armies were broken in the field. By September, the Emperor himself was a prisoner. By the autumn, the Prussian armies were at the gates of Paris, and the city, which a few months before had been the gayest in Europe, was a city under siege. The siege fell hardest upon the poor. The rich, who had laid in their stocks of preserved meat and of wine before the gates were closed, lived through the winter with no greater hardship than the inconvenience of cold rooms and the absence of the post. The poor, who had no such stocks, queued at the bread shops in the bitter mornings, in a line that wound sometimes for half a mile through the dark streets, and they took home their black bread, made of bran and chaff and a little flour, and they ate it slowly, and they were hungry again within the hour. The kitchens of the city, where she had once worked at the great French dishes of the empire, served now what could be had. The horses of the omnibus companies were slaughtered first, their meat was distributed by ration card, then the cab horses, then the dray horses, then at last the cherished riding horses of the gentry brought down weeping from their stables. The dogs and the cats of the city went next. The rats of the cellars went after them, and were sold at 6 francs a pound by the boys who caught them in the gutters. In the great glass-roofed market of Les Halles, the butcher's stalls hung with the strange, sad meat of the menagerie of the Jardin des Plantains. The camels, the antelopes, the kangaroos, and at last the 2 great elephants, Castor and Pollux, whose flesh was sold in thin red slices to those who could still pay the price. In the kitchens of Paris in this long winter, the cooks did what they could. They stewed what they were given. They stretched the small store of flour with sawdust from the carpenters' shops. They boiled the bones for the 3rd and the 4th time. They served, at the long deal tables of the boarding-houses, plates of soup upon which a single scrap of grey horse-meat floated like a leaf. The cold came down. The gas went out, for there was no coal to make it. The boulevards were lit, of an evening, by a single oil lamp at every corner, and the rest of the great city stood in darkness. By the end of January 1871, Paris had given up. The gates were opened. The Prussians marched in, paraded down the Champs-Élysées, and marched out again. And then, in March, the city, which had been broken by the war and the cold, broke itself a second time. The poor of the eastern districts rose against the new government of the Republic. They seized the cannon of the National Guard from the heights of Montmartre. They proclaimed a commune of the city. They raised upon the public buildings the red flag of revolt. For 2 months, Paris belonged to the Commune. The men of the eastern districts walked the streets with their rifles. The committees of the workmen sat in the town halls. The churches were closed. The great houses of the gentry stood empty. The kitchens of the working quarters fed those who were hungry. The kitchens of the rich, where they had not been left untended, were taken over by those who had cooked in them. There were many, in those streets of fire and of speeches, who had little to lose, and there were some, the records hint, who took up the cause of the Commune for the bread that it gave them, and for the company of those who had suffered with them through the long winter, and for the hope, however brief, that the world might at last belong to those who worked it. In the kitchens of Paris in those months were many countrywomen of the Gaume, of Brittany, of Normandy, of the Auvergne. They had lived through the siege as best they could. They had stood in the same long bread queues. They had eaten the same horse-meat and the same rats. And as the Commune ruled, some of them stood with the Commune, and some of them simply went on cooking and washing and mending and waiting for the world to settle. It did not settle gently. In the last week of May, the army of the Republic broke into the city. The fighting was savage. The streets ran red. The barricades, hastily thrown up by the communards, were swept away one by one. The great public buildings, the Tuileries, the Hôtel de Ville, the Palais de Justice, were set on fire by the retreating workmen, and the smoke of these fires hung over Paris for a week. By the end of that week, somewhere between 20 and 30,000 of the men and the women of the Commune had been killed. Many were shot by the firing squads in the cemeteries of Père-Lachaise and of Montparnasse. Many more were taken away in the long columns of prisoners that were marched under guard out of the city to the prison hulks at the coast. The names of those who had so much as cooked a meal for a communard were taken down. The lists were long. The trials were many. It was in the months after this bloody week that the long, slow tide of refugees began to wash up upon the streets of London. They came by the boat train, by the cattle boat, by any way that they could find, with their few belongings tied up in a square of cloth, with a little money in their pockets or with no money at all, and they made their way, by the old paths that the displaced of every nation had taken before them, to the cheap lodgings of Soho and Leicester Square and the streets behind the Tottenham Road. There they found their countrymen and their countrywomen. There they found small French restaurants where the cooks spoke their tongue. There they found agencies of employment that would, for a small fee, set them up in the kitchens and the laundries and the dressmakers' shops of the great houses of the West End. Among these refugees, by the end of the year, was a Belgian woman of the country of the gown, who had been in Paris through the siege and through the Commune, and who had taken her chance, when the firing squads had begun to walk the streets, of the longboat across the Channel. In London she found, at first, a place in a small French confiserie in the streets of Soho, where the sweets of Paris, the bonbons, the dragées, the candied chestnuts and the sugared almonds were made up in the back kitchen and sold across a marble counter to the French and Italian families of the quarter. The wages were small. The hours were long. The work was close. By the autumn, she had moved on. By the winter, she had moved on again. And by the very last days of December, she had answered an advertisement in one of the morning papers and had presented herself, with a written character from a previous mistress, at the area door of a small, dignified house upon Park Lane. The mistress of the house, a French widow, was at home that morning. The two women spoke together in their own language for a little while. The terms were agreed. The wages were named. The duties were set down. The new cook was to come in upon the first day of the new year, and to take charge, beneath the mistress, of the kitchen of the house. She was given the small room beneath the slates of the roof. She was given the keys to the larder and the pantry. And in the first weeks of the year of 1872, in a kitchen at the back of number 13 Park Lane, where the bells of the upper rooms hung in their ordered rows above the long deal table, the cooking fires were lit, and the long, slow rhythm of the new year began. The kitchen was warm. The copper pans hung upon their hooks. The knives were sharpened upon the small stone wheel that turned in the corner. The bread was set to rise upon the cold stone of the larder. And from the upper rooms of the house, by the wires that ran up through the walls, the bell of the dining room rang at 8:30 each morning, and the bell of the drawing room at 3:30 each afternoon, and the bell of the front door at every hour of every day, calling some quiet figure in a black dress and a white apron up the back stairs to wait upon the family that lived above. The fire in the kitchen burned steady through the long, dark afternoons. The clock above the dresser ticked steadily on. And the long foggy winter of London drew slowly to its quiet close, while the candles burned down in the rooms above, and the lamps of the lane outside flickered in the slow drift of the fog. Chapter 6. The Quiet House at 13. In the first weeks of the year 1872, the house at number 13 Park Lane settled into its winter pattern. Lamps were lit before 4 in the afternoon, when the brief grey London day fell into dusk. The fires were laid in every grate. The shutters were drawn against the cold by 5:30. The windows that looked out across the iron rails of the park toward the dark trees were closed against the long fog that came down each evening from the north and from the river. And within the house, in the polished and the curtained and the carpet-laid quiet of its rooms, the small daily rituals of a Mayfair household, in 2 languages and under one roof, went on as they had gone on, in much the same shape, in 10,000 other houses up and down the West End. The household was, by the count of its rooms and its servants and its weekly bills, a small one. There was the mistress of the house, in her widow's bombazine, who took her chocolate in her own room at 9 in the morning, and who came down to the breakfast room at 9:30. There was the daughter, who came down later, when she was at home after her late evenings at the theatre. There were the 3 servants. The cook, who lived in the basement and slept in a small room beneath the slates of the roof. The housemaid, an Englishwoman by the name of Elizabeth Watts, who rose at 5 and laid the morning fires, and the parlour-maid, who brought up the trays from the kitchen and answered the front door bell. And there was the small white dog, an old creature with a long, careful step, who slept in a basket beside the drawing-room fire, and who followed the mistress, when she was at home, from one room to another, the soft click of his nails upon the polished boards being one of the small, steady sounds of the upper floors. The day began, in such a household, before the day began for those who lived in the upper rooms. The housemaid was the first to rise. By the light of a single tallow candle in her cold attic, she dressed in her plain dark dress and her white apron. She pinned up her hair under her white cap, and she came down by the back stairs at 5 in the morning to begin her day. She blacked the grates of the breakfast room and the dining room. She lit the morning fires. She swept the carpets of the staircase. She brought up the brass-canned hot water for the mistress and the daughter. She laid the table for breakfast. By the time the rest of the household stirred, the lower rooms of the house were warm, the fires were burning steady, and the kettle in the kitchen was singing for the first cup of tea. The cook, by the rule of the household, rose at 6. She came down to the kitchen by way of the back stairs, in her plain dress and her white apron, with her hair drawn back beneath a linen cap, and she set herself to the long work of the kitchen day. She lit the great black range. She drew the water from the brass tap above the stone sink. She set the milks to warm for the mistress's chocolate. She put the rolls upon the warming shelf of the range. She prepared, in the slow, careful manner that she had brought with her from the kitchens of Paris, the small breakfast of the upper rooms. The soft eggs, the white bread cut very thin and warmed for a moment upon a long fork at the open mouth of the range, the small dish of preserved fruit, the little pot of black coffee. By 8:30, the breakfast was ready. The bell of the dining room rang at 9. The parlour maid carried the tray up the back stairs, and the mistress sat down to her morning meal at the small round table in the breakfast room, with the morning paper folded beside her plate. The mistress of the house was, by the report of those who knew her, a woman of careful and exacting habits. She kept her own accounts. She paid her own bills. She gave her own orders, in French, to the cook who stood in her plain apron at the breakfast-room door for the orders of the day. She had been, in the years before, the keeper of a small and a successful shop in Paris, and she ran her London household by the same care, in the same way. The orders for the day were given out at 9 o'clock in the morning. The marketing was attended to before noon. The afternoon was given over to the long, slow work of the dressmakers' bills and the tradespeople's accounts and the letters that came in by the morning post and went out again by the afternoon collection. By 4 o'clock the carriage, when she chose to take it, was at the door. By 5:30 the lamps were lit. At the back of the kitchen passage, beyond the larder and the scullery, and the dark coal cellar where the sacks of coal were tipped down through the iron grating from the street above, lay the small narrow room that the household called the pantry. It was, by the careful arrangement of the mistress, both the place where the silver was kept locked away in green baize-lined drawers, and the place where she herself, of an afternoon, would come down to write her household accounts at the small deal desk that stood beneath the high, barred window. Set into the wall behind the desk was a heavy iron safe. Within the safe were the bonds and the banknotes and the small red leather case that held the family papers, and the keys to all of these were carried, day and night, upon the little silver chatelaine that hung from the mistress's belt. The pantry could be locked from the inside or the outside. Its door was thick. Its window was small, and from within, when the door was shut, no sound from the kitchen passage could be heard. In the kitchen below, the long day of the cook went on. The midday meal of the upper rooms was prepared and sent up. The kitchen meal of the servants was eaten at the long deal table at 1 o'clock. The afternoon was given to the slow preparations for the evening, the cleaning of the vegetables, the trimming of the meat, the rolling out of the pastry for the small dishes of the second course. By 6 in the evening the kitchen was at the height of its work, the copper pans steaming upon the range, the knives flashing under the gas, the parlour-maid coming and going up the back stairs with the trays. By 7 the dinner was ready. By 8 it had been served. By 9 the dishes had come down again. By 10 the kitchen was at last quiet, and the cook sat at the long deal table with the housemaid and the parlour-maid, eating her own late supper, her hair coming a little loose under her cap, her hands red from the long day at the hot water of the sink. These were the small daily rhythms of the house. They were the rhythms of every house upon Park Lane. That within these rhythms, in this particular household, there were the strains that come, in such quarters, between the mistress who has come from a small shop to a polite address, and the cook who has come from a small farm to a hot kitchen. The orders were given and were taken, but they were given with a quick tongue, and they were taken with a quiet face that, from time to time, showed something other than agreement. The arguments, when they came, were in French. The housemaid, who spoke no French, heard only the rapid, sharp music of two voices that she could not understand. The mistress's voice rose first, as it usually rose. The cook's voice answered, slower, deeper, but no less sharp. And the words went back and forth between them down the long stone passage of the basement until, at last, the door of the kitchen closed, and the housemaid heard only the dull clink of the copper pans being set down upon the deal table, and the long, careful breath of the cook as she went back to her work. Such quarrels were not unknown in the polite houses of Mayfair, between French mistresses and Belgian cooks. They were not unknown between English mistresses and English cooks. The kitchens of London were full of them. They passed for the most part by some patching of the peace at the end of the week, when the wages were paid and the small grudges were swallowed and the day's work began again. But in the small houses of foreign tenants, where the lady of the house had come from her own kitchens of the past, and where she watched the new kitchen of the present with the eye of one who had once kept her own books, the quarrels could go on and could grow until at last the patience of one or the other gave out. Sundays in the house were quieter than the other days. The mistress, dressed in her long black gown and her small black bonnet, went out by carriage to attend the morning service at the French chapel in Soho, where the émigré priests of her own nation said the Mass in their own tongue, and where the polite refugees of Paris and Brussels gathered, after the service in the porch of the small church, to murmur together in soft French about the weather and the news of the home country. The cook, who was Catholic in her faith and Belgian in her birth, went out on Sunday afternoons when she could be spared, to a small Catholic chapel of her own choosing, and was gone, by long habit, for 2 or 3 hours of the afternoon. The housemaid, who was Church of England, attended a chapel of her own communion in the morning. The parlour-maid stayed in the house with the small white dog, and the rooms of number 13, on Sunday afternoons, lay in a deeper quiet still than the quiet of the weekday afternoons. By the middle of March, in the year 1872, the patience of the lady of number 13 Park Lane had given out. On or about the 20th of that month, the cook was given her notice. She was to leave at the end of the month. Her wages were to be paid up. Her character, that is, the written letter of recommendation that a servant carried with her from one place to another, and without which she could not easily find new work, was to be given to her at her departure. The notice was given. The notice was taken. The work of the kitchen, in the days that followed, went on, but it went on with a quietness that was not the old quietness. The cook was at the range as before. The bread rose upon the stone of the larder as before. The bells rang in their order from the rooms above. But the small black-painted ledger upon the kitchen dresser, in which the daily marketing was set down by the cook in a sloping French hand, showed, on certain days of those last 2 weeks, sums that did not quite agree with the weight of what came in at the area door. A pound of butter that had been bought was not quite a pound by the time it reached the larder. A small sum of change, set down upon the dresser, was sometimes not quite the sum that the parlour-maid remembered. The housemaid, who had begun to keep her own quiet count, said nothing. In the upper rooms the daughter went on with her life of the stage. She came home each midnight by hansom cab. She climbed the long staircase by the soft yellow light of the gas turned low. She sat at her small writing desk for a quarter of an hour, reading the letters of the day. She put out the lamp at 1. She slept until 10. The notice that her mother had given to the cook was a matter of the kitchen, and the kitchen in such a household was not the daughter's affair. Toward the very end of March, when the season at the theatre had given its actresses a few days of rest, the daughter packed her small trunk and made for Paris by the boat train. She left her mother in the house. She left the small white dog at the foot of the drawing-room fire. She left the 3 servants in their stations. And the house, upon the morning of her going, settled into a still deeper quiet than it had known before. The mistress of the house dined alone in the long, candle-lit dining-room. The fire burned low in the drawing-room grate. The small dog slept at her feet. The bells of the upper rooms rang in their order. The parlour-maid carried up the trays. The housemaid laid the morning fires. The cook in the basement kitchen kept on with her work, but the work of those last days was done in silence. The mistress, when she gave her orders at the breakfast-room door, gave them shortly. The cook, when she took them shortly in return. And the long passage of the basement, between the kitchen and the pantry and the larder and the coal cellar, lay quiet in the cool, faint air. The first days of April came on. The sun, when it came at all, came through a soft yellow haze. The trees of the park were beginning to come into leaf. The lamps along Park Lane were lit a little later each evening, as the long English spring began to lengthen the days. And in the house at number 13, the small daily rituals went on, the morning fires, the morning tea, the morning bells, the morning marketing. And within the small household, in those last few days, the silence between the woman in the bombazine and the woman in the white apron grew deeper and deeper, until at last there was very little spoken at all between them. The candle on the dresser burned low. The clock in the hall struck the hour. and the long evenings of early April drew slowly down upon Mayfair, and upon Park Lane, and upon the quiet house at number 13. Chapter 7. A Sunday in April. The morning of Sunday, the 7th of April 1872, came up grey and quiet over the long line of Mayfair. The night fog had cleared a little. A thin, weak sun was rising above the rooftops to the east, and the bells of the parish churches, which had been silent through the long week, began their slow, careful Sabbath ringing as the first of the worshippers came out from their houses into the cold spring air. The streets of the West End were empty at this early hour. The carts of the milkmen and the bakers had already come and gone. The shutters of the small shops were closed for the day. The great houses stood quiet behind their drawn curtains, their iron lamps unlit, their brass knockers gleaming dully in the pale light. From the chimneys of those houses the soft grey threads of the morning fires went up into the still air, met the upper layer of the haze, and there mingled slowly into the long, slow drift of smoke that hung above the roofs of London upon every still spring morning. By 8 o'clock the bells of St. George's, Hanover Square, had begun to ring. By 9 those of St. Mark's, North Audley Street, had answered them. By 9:30 the bells of the Grosvenor Chapel and of St. Paul's, Knightsbridge, had taken up the slow, careful ringing as well, and across the long, polite quarter of the West End, from Piccadilly to Oxford Street, from Bond Street to the eastern edge of Hyde Park, the slow grave music of the Sabbath rose into the cold morning air, and the families of the great houses came out, in their long, dark Sunday clothes, to climb into their carriages and to be carried, by their slow-trotting horses, to the doors of the churches of their choosing. In Hyde Park, on Sundays, the great wide carriage drives were given over to a quieter traffic than that of the working week. The riders of Rotten Row were few. The carriages of the gentry, which on weekdays moved up and down the long sand drives in their slow, stately procession, were thinner upon the sand by Sunday rule. The keepers walked their measured rounds. The swans drifted in slow circles upon the still grey water of the Serpentine. Children in their best Sunday clothes were led by their nurses across the open grass toward the round pond, and from the great clock of the parish church of St. George's, far away across the rooftops, the bells went on with their long, slow ringing, marking off the careful intervals of the morning service. Within the house at number 13 Park Lane, the day began as every Sunday began. The housemaid had risen at 5:30. She had come down by the back stairs in her plain dress and her white apron. She had blacked the grate of the breakfast room and laid the morning fire. She had drawn back the curtains of the dining room. She had brought up the morning hot water for the mistress. By 8:30 the lower rooms were warm. By 9 the table was laid for the breakfast. The mistress came down at 9:30. She was dressed in her widow's black, with her chatelaine of small silver keys at her belt. She took her chocolate at the small round table in the breakfast room. She read, by the soft yellow light of the gas, the morning paper that the housemaid had laid beside her plate. The small white dog lay at her feet upon the hearth-rug. The fire crackled steadily in the grate. By 10:15 she had finished her breakfast. By 10:30 she had gone up to her dressing-room. By 11 she had come down again, in her bonnet, her shawl, her gloves, and her widow's veil, carrying her small parasol over her arm. She told the housemaid in the hall that she was going for a walk in Green Park, which lay only a short way to the south, beyond the quiet streets of Mayfair, beyond the back of Buckingham Palace, where the long avenues of plane trees ran down toward the smoke of Westminster. She said that she would be back, by way of a small call upon a friend in Curzon Street, in time for an appointment that was set for 4 o'clock that afternoon. She gave the parlour-maid, in passing, a small list of 2 or 3 matters that were to be attended to in her absence. She bent for a moment to pat the head of the small white dog that had followed her into the hall, and she went. Then, by way of the staircase that led down to the area and through the basement passage to the kitchen, in order to give to the cook her last orders for the small dinner that was to be served upon her return at 4:30. What passed between the 2 women in the kitchen, in that quarter of an hour, when the housemaid was upstairs at her work, and the parlour-maid was at the front door taking in the morning's second post, no living soul has ever known. The kitchen was a long, low room, its single window opening only upon the deep stone area beneath the railings of the street. Its door, when it was closed, closing thickly upon the rest of the basement passage. The fire in the great black range was burning steady. The copper pans were upon their hooks. The knives lay upon the deal table. The bread was rising beneath a clean white cloth. upon the cool stone of the larder shelf at the side. Whatever words were spoken in that room, in their own French tongue, between the woman in the widow's bombazine and the woman in the white apron, were spoken behind a closed door and were heard by no one. Some time after, in the long, slow quiet of the Sunday morning, the cook came up the back stairs into the upper hall. She told a housemaid that the mistress had gone out by way of the basement door for her walk in Green Park, and that she would be back, as she had said, in time for the appointment at 4. The housemaid, who had been at her work upon the staircase, took the news as she had taken many similar pieces of news before, and went on with her brushing of the carpet rods. The parlour-maid took it in the same way. The small white dog, who had been lying at the foot of the stairs, lifted his head once, looked toward the front door, and then settled again upon the carpet to sleep. The morning wore on. The bells of the parish churches rang the half-hours. The carriages of the gentry rolled past upon the wet stones of Park Lane, on their way back from the morning service. The wind shook the bare upper branches of the plane trees in the park. The smoke went on rising, thread upon thread, from the chimneys of the long row of houses upon the lane. And in the basement of number 13, in the long stone passage between the kitchen and the pantry and the larder and the coal cellar, the cook went on with her work, and the housemaid went on with hers, and the parlour-maid sat for a few minutes upon the bottom step of the back stairs to mend the hem of her apron in the soft yellow light of the gas turned low. Within the long stone passage of the basement, the air had a particular cool stillness that the rest of the house, in the carpet and the curtain and the firelit warmth above, did not know. The flagstones of the passage were chill underfoot. The walls, painted a pale cream long since darkened by years of cooking smoke, ran narrow and low. From the bells of the upper rooms, hanging in their ordered rows above the long deal table of the kitchen, no ring came in those slow noon hours. The dining-room bell did not ring, for there was no order to be carried up. The drawing-room bell did not ring, for there was no one in the drawing-room to ring it. The bedroom bell did not ring, for the master bedroom door was closed, and the lady of the house was thought to be out. Only the front door bell, at one or two intervals during the long afternoon, rang once or twice upstairs, as some caller left a card upon the silver tray, and as the parlour-maid came down quietly to the front door to take it, and as the door was closed again, and the house returned to its quiet. Around midday the housemaid said something, in passing, about going down to fetch up a scuttle of coals from the aisle for the upstairs grates. The cook, by some quietly given reason, asked her not to do so. There was no need, she said. The fires would burn well enough until the next morning. The housemaid, who had no cause to wonder, did not wonder. She went up to her work in the upper rooms. The cook went on with hers in the kitchen, and the door of the coal cellar, which was the small dark room at the end of the basement passage, where the sacks of coal were tipped down through the iron grating from the street above, stayed closed. The afternoon came on. The bells of the churches rang for the afternoon service. The streets of Mayfair were once again given over to the slow, careful procession of the Sunday carriages. In the basement of number 13 the cook went, at some quiet hour, down the long stone passage to the small narrow room at the back, where the silver was kept and the household accounts were written, and where, set into the wall above the small deal desk, lay the heavy iron door of the safe. The keys, which were always carried upon the chatelaine of the lady of the house, were now in another hand. The door of the safe was opened. The banknotes were taken. The bonds were taken. The small red leather case of the family papers was taken. The jewels, in their small velvet boxes, were left upon the shelf, untouched, as though they had been judged of no account. And the door of the iron safe was closed once again. By 4 o'clock the appointment of the mistress had not been kept. By 5, the visitor who had come to call had left her card upon the silver tray and gone away. By 5:30 the lamps had been lit in the lower rooms. By 6 the housemaid had begun to wonder, in her quiet English way, that the mistress had still not returned. By 7 she had spoken of it to the parlour-maid, and the parlour-maid had said that perhaps the mistress had stayed to dine with her friend in Curzon Street. By 7:30 the cook had come up from the basement, in her plain dress and her white apron and her linen cap, and had told the 2 other servants that she was going out, by long habit, to the Catholic chapel for the evening service, and would not be back, perhaps, until very late. She put on her bonnet. She put on her shawl. She took up her small basket. She let herself out by the area door. She did not go to the chapel. She walked along Park Lane to the corner of Piccadilly, where the rank of the hansom cabs stood. She took a cab. She gave the driver an address. The cab bell rang. The horse moved off, and in a quarter of an hour she had been set down at the platform of Victoria Station, where the boat train for Folkestone and the long grey night crossing to France stood at the platform, the gas burning along the long glass roof, the porters walking among the long glass roof, the porters walking among the carriages with their barrows, the whistle of the engine rising in a single high note into the dim glass of the upper air. She bought a ticket. She climbed into a third-class carriage. The doors slammed shut. The whistle blew, and the train pulled out of Victoria Station by the dark river, by the lights of Battersea, southward into the long Kentish night. Behind her, in the basement of number 13 Park Lane, the kitchen lay quiet. The fire in the great black range had burned down to a low red glow. The copper pans hung upon their hooks. The knives lay upon the deal table. The bread, which had risen upon the larder shelf in the morning, lay still beneath its clean white cloth. The door of the pantry, at the very end of the passage, was closed and locked from the outside. The key was gone. Above, in the upper rooms of the house, the housemaid and the parlour-maid sat together by the dying drawing-room fire in some perplexity. The small white dog lay between them. The clock upon the chimney-piece struck 9, and then 10, and then 11. The bells of the churches called the hour. The lamps along Park Lane burned steady in the slow drift of the fog, and from the basement beneath their feet came no sound at all. By midnight the housemaid had at last gone up to her own bed beneath the slates of the roof. By midnight the parlour-maid had laid the small white dog down in his basket beside the drawing-room hearth. By midnight the fire in the basement kitchen had at last died out. The clock above the dresser, which had ticked all day through the long slow hours of the Sunday, was the last sound in the house. It struck the hour of midnight in a small slow chime, and then in its careful way it ticked on, for an hour, for another, and at last, when no one had wound it, it fell still. The fog of the small hours drew in around the house. The lamps along the lane burned soft and yellow, hour upon hour, in their tall iron stems. The constables walked their measured beats upon the wet stones, and number 13 Park Lane lay quiet beneath its blanket of yellow fog, with the small white dog asleep upon the hearth, with the housemaid asleep beneath the slates of the roof, and with the long basement passage at the very back of the house given over to the deep, particular silence of an empty room. Chapter 8. The Pantry Door. Monday morning came up grey and cold over the long line of Park Lane on the 8th of April, 1872. The fog of the night had thinned but not gone. It lay low along the wet stones of the lane, and above it the upper stories of the houses rose into the pale, weak sunlight that was beginning to break through from the east. The carts of the tradespeople were already abroad. The carriages of the gentry stood ready in the mews. The clocks of the parish churches struck 7. The bells of the milkmen could be heard from the area doors, where the cooks of the great houses came up the stone steps to take in the morning's pail. A few miles to the south, at Victoria Station, the morning mail train from the coast had just come in. The long glass roof above the platform echoed with the slow hiss of the cooling engine. The porters in their blue coats were going up and down beside the carriages with their barrows. The travellers who had crossed the grey channel in the night and had passed the dark hours of the journey from Folkestone in the slow, swaying compartments of the train were stepping down upon the platform now, their faces pale with the long sea, their cloaks heavy with the long sea, their cloaks heavy with the damp of the crossing, their hat boxes and their small trunks being lifted out from the racks above the seats. Among them was a young, dark-haired Parisian in a long travelling cloak and a small black bonnet, with the slim, careful bearing of a young actress. She had crossed from Paris by the night train. She had been at sea in the small hours. She had slept little. The long whistle of the engine, as the train had pulled into the platform, had brought her at last out of the doze in which she had passed the last few miles of the run. She found her trunk. She paid her porter. She came out at last under the great glass arch of the station entrance into the cold London morning, and she hailed a hansom cab from the rank. The cab carried her up through the wet streets of Pimlico and Belgravia, past the long stucco fronts of Eaton Square and Belgrave Square, past the iron railings of the small private gardens, past the milk carts and the bread carts of the early hour, and out at last upon the eastern pavement of Hyde Park, where the long line of Park Lane ran upward toward the north. By a few minutes after 8, she had been set down upon the wet flagstones in front of number 13. She paid her cabman. She lifted her small trunk upon the white-painted step. She raised the brass lion's head knocker upon the black-painted door, and she knocked. The housemaid opened the door. The young actress saw upon her face a kind of pale and uncertain look that she had not seen there before. She came into the hall. She put off her cloak. She asked in a quiet voice where her mother was. The housemaid said that she did not know. Madame had gone out the day before for a walk in Green Park. The cook, in the early evening, had said that Madame would dine with a friend in Curzon Street and would be home late. By midnight, Madame had not returned. The housemaid and the parlour-maid, not knowing what to think, had sat up by the drawing-room fire until 11, and had then put themselves to bed. Madame had not come back during the night. Madame was not in her bedroom now. Her bed had not been slept in. The cook, who had said the night before that she was going to the Catholic chapel for the evening service, had not come back either. The young actress went up the stairs to her mother's bedroom. The bed was undisturbed. The dressing-table was, as the mistress had left it the morning before, the silver-backed brushes and the small porcelain pots in their usual order. The wardrobe stood open. The bonnet and the shawl in which the mistress had gone out the day before were not there. She went down again to the hall. She thought at first that perhaps her mother had been delayed at her friend's house in Curzon Street. She sent the parlour-maid upon a small errand to that street with a quiet message of inquiry. The parlour-maid was gone for half an hour. She came back to say that no one in Curzon Street had seen the mistress at all the day before, and that no appointment had ever been made between them for the 4 o'clock hour or for the evening dinner. The young actress sat down upon the chair in the hall. She thought then that perhaps her mother was upon the road from Paris, having crossed in the night to meet her by some other train. She sent the housemaid to the post-box at the corner of the lane with a message to be sent to a friend or two of the family, asking after her mother's whereabouts. The housemaid was gone 20 minutes. She came back with no news at all. By 8:45 the young actress had begun to walk slowly, one room after another, through the lower part of the house. She went into the drawing-room, where the fire of the day before had long since died, and the small white dog lay shivering in his basket upon the hearth. She went into the dining-room, where the table was still laid from the night before, for a dinner that had never been eaten. She went into the breakfast-room, where the morning paper lay folded upon the small round table, and where the chocolate cup of the day before had not been cleared away. She went at last, by way of the staircase that led down to the basement, into the long stone passage of the lower offices. The flagstones rang faintly beneath her shoes. The air was cool. The gas in the kitchen passage was turned low. She came first to the kitchen. The fire was out. The copper pans hung upon their hooks. The knives lay upon the deal table. The bread, beneath its clean white cloth, lay still upon the larder shelf, unrisen now, gone hard. She came next to the larder, which was as it had been left. She came next to the scullery, which was as it had been left. She came last to the small narrow room at the very end of the passage, which the household called the pantry. She turned the brass handle of the door. The door did not move. She turned the handle again. The door did not move. The door was locked. She felt, by some quiet instinct, the want of the keys upon her own waist. She remembered in the same instant that the keys were always carried upon her mother's chatelaine. She went then by quick steps up the back stairs to the hall, and she sent the housemaid to fetch a constable from the rank at Hyde Park Corner. The constable, when he came, was a tall man in his long blue coat, with his bull's-eye lantern at his belt, and his measured step that the polished boots of the Metropolitan Police made upon the marble of the hall. He listened to the story of the housemaid and of the young actress. He went down by the back stairs. He came to the small narrow door of the pantry. He turned the handle. He found the door locked. He laid his shoulder against the door, and the door in its old wooden frame gave at last with a sharp sound and swung in. The room within was dark. The single small window opened only upon the deep stone area, and was high in the wall, and was barred. The constable struck a match. He held up his lantern. Upon the floor, between the small deal desk and the heavy iron door of the safe, lay the body of the lady of the house. She was upon her side, in the long black bombazine of her widow's gown. Her chatelaine was at her belt, but the keys upon it were not all the keys that ought to have been there. A length of stout cord was drawn tight about her throat. Marks of violence were upon her face and her hands. Her eyes were open. The lantern of the constable shook a little in his hand. He said nothing for a long moment. He took off his helmet. He turned. He went up by the back stairs and into the hall. He told the parlour-maid to send at once for the divisional surgeon, and for the inspector of the division, and to send word also to the magistrate at Marlborough Street. He went out himself to the front step, and he stood there in his long blue coat, his hands behind his back, his face set, until the small crowd of cooks and housemaids and small boys that had begun to gather upon the pavement had been moved gently along. By 10 o'clock the inspector of the division had come. By 10:30 the divisional surgeon had come. By 11 a small group of plain-clothes detectives in their black coats and their tall hats had come up by cab from Scotland Yard, and the long, slow, careful work of the police had begun. They went first into the kitchen. They saw the fire long out, the pans upon their hooks, the bread lying still upon the larder shelf. They saw upon the deal table certain marks. They saw upon the flagstones of the passage a long dark line that ran from the kitchen door to the door of the coal cellar, and from the door of the coal cellar to the door of the pantry. They opened the coal cellar. They saw upon the dust of the floor the impression of a heavy body that had lain there for some hours. They closed the coal cellar. They went into the pantry. They examined the body. They examined the safe, which was found unlocked but closed. They examined the small deal desk. They took down the household ledgers. They took down the little black painted account book of the cook. They took down the names of the tradespeople. They asked of the housemaid and of the parlour-maid what they remembered of the day before. By the middle of the afternoon a description of the cook had been written down. She was, by the report of the housemaid, a Belgian woman of 29 years, broad-shouldered, somewhat tall for her sex, with a fresh, rough complexion, dark hair, and brown eyes. She was thought to have left the house at about 7:30 the night before. Her bonnet, her shawl, and her travelling bag were not in her room. The keys of the larder, the pantry, the safe, and the area door were missing. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, telegrams had been sent to the police of the railway stations, to the police of the Channel ports, and, by way of the newer wires that ran beneath the sea, to the police of Paris itself. By 5 o'clock the news of the murder in Park Lane had been carried, by the boys with their handfuls of late editions, to every corner of the West End. By 6 o'clock the front step of number 13 was crowded with a small, quiet, watchful press of newspaper men in their long coats, their notebooks open, their pencils ready, and the constables in their long blue coats stood upon the steps to keep them back. Within the house the long, slow afternoon went on. A small white dog had been carried up to the bedroom of the young actress, where he lay shivering in her arms. The fires in the upper grates had been lit. The body of the lady of the house had been lifted with a great care by the men of the divisional mortuary upon a long covered handcart, and had been carried out by the area door, and had been wheeled away by a quiet route through the streets of Mayfair to the small mortuary chapel where the inquest would be held. By 7 the gas lamps along the lane had been lit. By 8 the windows of the upper rooms had been shuttered. By 9 the small crowd upon the pavement had at last begun to drift away. The constables stayed on. The fog of the spring evening came down once more from the river and the marshes. The lamps along Park Lane burned steady in their tall iron stems. The carriages of the gentry rolled past upon the wet stones. Very slowly the heads of those within turned, in spite of themselves, to look at the closed door of number 13 as they went by. The young actress sat alone in the upper drawing-room, by the small fire that the housemaid had laid for her. The little white dog slept in her lap. The lamp upon the small writing desk had not been lit. The fire burned low. The shutters were drawn. The bell of the dining-room, which had rung every evening at 7:30 for as long as she had lived in this house, did not ring, and the long evening drew slowly down upon the house upon Park Lane. Chapter 9. The Trail Across the Channel. The morning telegram from Scotland Yard, when it reached the Préfecture de Police at the Quai des Orfèvres in Paris on the morning of Tuesday the 9th of April 1872, was a short one. A murder had been committed the night before last in a respectable house in the West End of London. The suspected hand was that of a Belgian woman of 29 years, who had been employed as a cook in the house, and who was known to have crossed by the boat train to Folkestone on the Sunday evening, to have taken the night boat across the Channel, and to have arrived in Paris by the morning of the 8th. A description followed. Her name, so far as she had given it in her papers, was Marguerite Dixblanc. She was last seen in the streets of the city. The Préfecture was asked in the courteous, careful French of the diplomatic clerks to make such inquiries as it could. The prefecture, as it happened, was not unaccustomed to such requests. The wire that ran beneath the channel from Dover to Calais, and from Calais up to the Boulevard du Palais, had been busy with such requests for 15 years. The coming and going between the two cities had been so steady, in those years of peace and railways and packet boats, that the police of London and the police of Paris had grown used to working with one another upon the long list of small and great matters that crossed the sea between them. The runaway clerks who had taken the firm's money to the boulevards, the absconding husbands of one country found in the lodgings of the other, the petty thieves who had hoped, by the simple device of a crossing, to slip out from the reach of one set of constables into two others. The cooperation between these two great forces of the law, although it had no formal basis in any treaty between the two governments, had grown up by the slow practice of years. A clerk in Paris would write to a clerk in London, and a clerk in London would write to a clerk in Paris, and the small, careful inquiries of two cities of 3 million souls each would be exchanged across the wire and the post in the polite, formal language of police clerks. The one set of detectives knew the names of the other set. The one set knew the boulevards as well as their own streets. The one set spoke the other's tongue, after a fashion, with the small set phrases of inquiry and arrest. And the men who came down to Paris from London were not strangers to the offices of the prefecture. Nor were the men who came up to London from Paris strangers to the offices of Scotland Yard. By the afternoon of the same day, 2 inspectors of the detective branch at Scotland Yard had been put upon the boat train at Charing Cross. They were sober men in their dark coats and their tall hats. They carried, in small leather wallets, a copy of the description of the missing woman, a photograph of her. The photograph of her being been obtained from a small studio in Soho where she had once, with 2 of her countrywomen, sat for a likeness, and a sheaf of papers from the magistrate at Marlborough Street that gave them their authority within the realm. They were carried down through the long darkening evening into Kent to Folkestone, to the boat, and across the still grey channel through the night. By the morning of Wednesday, the 10th of April, they had been received at the prefecture in Paris, where they were given the courtesy of 2 French inspectors of their own rank, men in long blue coats, with the small red ribbon of the Legion of Honour upon their lapels, and where the long, slow, 4-cornered hunt began. The Paris into which they came was a city still in its slow recovery from the wars and the risings of the year before. The boulevards that the great Baron Haussmann had cut through the old quarters in the time of the Empire were still there, broad and clean and lined with their tall white houses. But the great public buildings that had been burnt during the last week of the Commune still stood, in many places, as gaunt black ruins, their roofs gone, their walls open to the sky, their floors filled with the rain of the spring. The Tuileries Palace was a ruin. The Hôtel de Ville was a ruin. Long stretches of the Rue de Rivoli were still in the slow process of being rebuilt. The great cemetery of Père Lachaise still bore upon its eastern wall the marks of the bullets of the firing squads of the previous May. It was through these streets that the morning omnibuses now ran once again. It was upon these pavements that the dressmakers' girls now hurried, in their long aprons and their plain bonnets, to their workshops in the great houses behind the Rue de la Paix. It was at these corners that the chestnut sellers had set up their small charcoal braziers, although the chestnuts of the season were now long gone, and the men sold instead the small thin pancakes of the spring. The trams of the northern lines ran out from the Place de la Bastille to the eastern suburbs. The blue-coated keepers of the public gardens swept the long sand-walks, and the country of the working poor, which had risen in the year before and had been cut down with such bitter cost, went on with its quiet, careful, hungry rhythms. In the spring weather of 72, the detectives walked the streets where the working women of the city lived. They went into the cheap lodging-houses behind the Gare du Nord. They went into the small French-speaking cafes where the Belgians of the quarter took their morning coffee. They put the photograph upon the table. They asked the question. They were given, more often than not, the small shrug and the shake of the head that the people of those streets had learned to give to any stranger in a long blue coat. Sometimes they were given a name, or a hint, or a half-remembered face. They followed each one. They came back to the prefecture each evening with their notebooks open. By the 3rd day the trail had begun to lead northward. There had been an old woman at a lodging-house in the Rue de Faubourg Saint-Denis remembered, a tall Belgian woman who had taken a room there for one night and had paid in English money, and who had spoken, in passing, of going to find her cousin in the small town of Saint-Denis, just beyond the gates of the city. The cousin's name was given. The detectives took a cab to the gates. They went out by the long, dusty road to Saint-Denis. Saint-Denis in those years was a town of the working sort. It lay only a short distance to the north of Paris, but it lay outside the great walls of the city, and it had, by long history, the small, separate, factory-smelling life of its own. It had its old cathedral church where the kings of France had been buried for 1,000 years, the great Gothic vaults of the choir rising above the worn flankstones of the nave. But around the cathedral, in the years of the Empire and the Republic, had grown up the long red brick warehouses of the gasworks, the dye works, the locomotive shops of the Northern Railway. The streets of the town were narrow and grey. The smell upon the air was of coal smoke and of the chemicals of the dye works. The houses of the workmen ran in long rows behind the factories, plain and small, their windows narrow, their doors set straight upon the street. It was in one of these small streets in the late afternoon that the four men, the two from London and the two from Paris, came at last to the address that they had been given. It was a small coal merchant's shop, set into the corner of a low row of houses. The window was grimmed with the dust of the trade. The lettering above the door, in faded red paint, gave the name of the proprietor and the long word, Charbon. Within, the front of the shop was a counter of dark wood, behind which the small black scales of the merchant stood upon the counter. The back of the shop was a low room with a single small window opening upon a yard piled high with the sacks of coal. The shopkeeper, a small grey-haired Frenchman in a leather apron, was at the counter when the detectives came in. They asked, by name, after the woman they had been seeking. The shopkeeper looked at them for a moment, and looked then to a low door at the back of the shop, and said, in the quiet, careful manner of a man who had been told a thing he had not expected to be told, that there was indeed within his back room at this very moment a Belgian woman of about that name who had been with him for the last day or two, and who, by some quiet pressure of her own conscience or of the silence of his small back room, had only that very afternoon begun to tell him a thing that he had not wished to hear. The detectives went in. They found her at the table of the back room, with a small cup of black coffee at her elbow and a heavy travelling bag at her feet. They told her in their careful French the charge upon which they had come. She did not deny what was put to her. She did not run. She rose, and she put on her shawl, and she came with them. The bag was opened upon the counter of the shop. Within it, wrapped in a piece of old newspaper, were the bonds and the banknotes in the small red leather case of the family papers of the house upon Park Lane, together with a few small pieces of clothing and a little money in French and English coin. The keys of the safe and of the pantry were found in her own pocket. The matter of her extradition took some little time. There was the question of her nationality, which was Belgian and not French. There was the question of the country in which she ought to be tried for the act, which by the comity of the two nations was decided to be England, where the act had been committed. There was the question of the warrant of the magistrate at Marlborough Street, which was sent across by special dispatch and was countersigned by the magistrate at the prefecture. And there was the long, slow paperwork of the embassy clerks at the embassy. While these matters went on, she was kept in a small cell at the central prison of the city, in the long, quiet building of grey stone behind the Quai des Orfèvres. By the latter part of the month, the papers had at last been signed. Upon a quiet morning in the second half of April, she was brought out of the prison by a back gate in the early hours, with 2 French inspectors and 2 English ones beside her, and placed in a closed carriage that was driven at a measured pace through the empty boulevards to the Gare du Nord. There she was put into a reserved compartment of the morning train. The doors were locked. The blinds were drawn. The whistle blew, and the train pulled out of the station by the long red brick walls of the station yards, northward through the open country of the Ile-de-France toward the coast. The journey was a long one. The train ran north through Picardy, past the small grey stone towns of the wheat country, past the long flat fields and the slow rivers and the orchards in their first leaf of the spring. By the late afternoon they had come to Calais. The boat was waiting at the harbour. The 4 men took her aboard by a quiet route along the side of the deck and into a small private cabin in the stern. The boat sailed at dusk. The grey channel rolled beneath them through the long night. The wind from the west sent the spray over the rail of the upper deck. The lights of Calais, very small and very yellow upon their long pier, fell behind into the dock of the water. The funnel of the steamer streamed its long red sparks into the night. The bell of the watch upon the bridge rang the half-hours through the slow run. By the small hours, the dark line of the cliffs of England had risen upon the western horizon, white in the moonlight against the dark sea. And by the first grey light of the morning, the boat had come at last to the harbour of Dover, where the small lamps along the pier burned faint in the slow lifting of the dawn. But London, by some careful arrangement of the railway clerks and the police, was not their destination. The carriage in which they sat went through the small suburban stations of Bromley and Beckenham and Sydenham, until at last, at the station of Herne Hill, in a quiet South London suburb, the train was stopped, and the small party of 4 detectives and the woman they had brought with them stepped down upon the platform. A closed cab was waiting. They climbed in. The blinds were drawn. The cab moved off, by way of the southern bridges, into the heart of the city. By the middle of the morning they had been set down at the back gate of the police cells at Bow Street, and the woman had been delivered into the hands of the magistrate. In the streets of the West End that morning, the news of the return of the prisoner was being shouted by the boys with the late editions at every corner. Crowds gathered upon the pavements outside the magistrate's court. The bells of the parish churches rang the hour. The carriages of the gentry rolled past the door of number 13 Park Lane, where the windows of the upper rooms had been shuttered and the brass knocker had been wrapped by the housemaid in a small piece of black crape. The lamps along the lane burned low against the grey morning. The constables walked their measured beats, and the long, slow law of the kingdom, with its papers and its signatures and its careful, measured pace, gathered itself for the work of the months that lay ahead. The fog drew in. The bells of the churches went on with their slow ringing of the quarter hours. The clock of St. Stephen's, far away across the river at Westminster, struck the hour of noon, and the city, in its long, careful way, returned to its quiet. Chapter 10. The Old Bailey and the Last Gaslight. The trial of the Park Lane case opened at the Central Criminal Court of the Old Bailey upon a hot June day in 1872. The Old Bailey in that year was an old building. It had stood in much the same shape since the rebuilding of 1774, and it had taken its name, by the long use of the centuries, from the lane of the same name that ran along the western wall of the City of London, between the Church of St. Sepulchre and the great prison of Newgate. The court itself was a small, dark, oak-panelled room, with a high judge's bench beneath the carved royal arms, with a long oak table in the centre for the clerks and the counsel, with a low-railed dock on one side for the prisoner, and with the long benches of the press and the public on the other. The sun of the June morning came in through the high windows in pale, dusty shafts. The wigs of the counsel and the gowns of the clerks moved softly as the court rose for the entrance of the judge. The judge upon the bench was a man of advanced years, who had sat upon the courts of the kingdom for many seasons, and who was known, in the small world of the law, for the careful, even quiet of his manner upon the bench, and for the close and patient attention that he gave to the evidence in his court. He took his seat. The court took its seats. The case was called. The prisoner, brought up by the small inner stair from the cells below, took her place in the dock. The clerk read out the charge. She was asked how she pleaded. She pleaded not guilty. The case for the Crown was opened by the leading sergeant at law of the prosecution, a man well known in the courts of the kingdom, who set out, in his careful, measured manner, the long story of the matter that had brought them to that room, the household upon Park Lane, the cook from Belgium, the quarrels of the spring, the Sunday in April, the locked pantry, the missing keys, the train to Paris, the arrest at St. Denis, the bonds and the peck notes found in the heavy travelling bag. The witnesses came to the box one after another. The housemaid, in her plain dark dress, gave her evidence in a quiet voice. The parlour-maid gave hers. The young actress, the daughter of the dead lady, gave hers in a voice that was, by all accounts, very low and very steady, although she had to be helped at 1 or 2 points with a glass of water from the small carafe upon the rail of the witness box. The 2 inspectors of the Metropolitan Police gave theirs. The 2 inspectors of the prefecture, who had come over from Paris for the purpose, gave theirs through an interpreter. Lord Lucan was called. He came up from the body of the court to the witness box, an old soldier of 72 in his black frock coat, with the small white moustache of his rank and the slow, stiff bearing of a man who had seen long service in the cavalry of the Queen, and he gave his evidence with a dry, careful brevity that did not, by all accounts, make for an easy quarter-hour. careful brevity that did not, by all accounts, make for an easy quarter hour. He said that he had known the dead lady for some years. He said that he had at one time, at her request, cashed a bill for her in the sum of several £100s. He said that he had had no other dealing of a private kind with her, or with any other person of her household. He was not pressed further. He stepped down. The matter of who had paid for the lease of the house upon Park Lane was, by the careful courtesy of the bench, allowed to fall away. The case for the defence was a short one. Counsel for the prisoner sought to set out the long history of the quarrels in the kitchen, the sharp tongue of the dead lady, the notice given without good cause, the short temper of the prisoner, and the rising of a hot French passion in the heat of an argument that had ended, by some quick and unmeant act, in the death of the mistress at the hand of the cook. Provocation was the word. The judge, in his summing up, considered the word, and put the law upon it to the jury. Words alone, he told them, however hot, did not in the law of England rise to the kind of provocation that could reduce the charge of murder to that of manslaughter. The act of killing, when it followed only upon a quarrel of words, was murder. The jury was sent out. They were not gone for very long. They came back. The foreman rose. The verdict was given. It was the verdict of murder. The judge took up the small black square of cloth that, by the old form of the law of England, was placed upon the head of the bench when sentence of death was to be pronounced. He spoke in his quiet voice, the words of the form. The prisoner was to be taken from the place where she stood to the prison whence she had come, and thence, upon a day to be appointed, to a place of lawful execution, and there to be hanged by the neck until she was dead, and the Lord have mercy upon her soul. The court rose. The prisoner was taken down by the small inner stair to the cells. The crowd in the street outside the courthouse was very large and very loud as the closed van of the prison carried her out, by a back gate, to the long road that led northward to Newgate. The boys with the late editions ran through the streets. The bells of St. Sepulchre rang the hour. The polite world of London, reading its papers in its drawing-rooms that evening, set down its teacups and shook its head and said that justice had been done. But justice in the Kingdom of England, in that year, was a more careful matter than the words of the form alone. There were, upon the question of the sentence, certain quiet considerations that were not pressed in the open court, but that found their way, by the quiet paths of the back stairs of the great offices of state, to the small rooms of the Home Office in Whitehall. There was the question of provocation, which the law had refused, but which the public, by some slow softening of opinion, was beginning to feel. There was the question of the conduct of the dead lady, which had not been wholly clear in the evidence, and which the boulevard papers, in Paris and in London, had not let alone. There was the question of the relationship of the dead lady's daughter to a certain English nobleman of high position, which had not been pressed in court, but which was the talk of every club in Pall Mall. And there was the question, beneath all of these questions, of the long quiet feeling of the late Victorian age that the hanging of a woman was a thing that ought, where it could be avoided, to be avoided. The papers went up to the Home Secretary. The Home Secretary considered. The papers went up to the Queen. The Queen considered. And in the slow, careful way of the kingdom, the sentence of death pronounced at the Old Bailey was, by the royal warrant of mercy, commuted to a sentence of penal servitude for life. The crowd that had stood in the street outside the prison upon the morning of the appointed execution went home without seeing the small black flag of the hangman raised upon the prison wall. The papers murmured. Some called it a miscarriage of justice. Some called it a kindness. The polite world set down its teacups once again, and shook its head once again, and went on with its long evening. The years that followed laid their long, careful silence upon the matter. The prisoner was taken away to one of the great female prisons of the kingdom, where the walls were high and the days were long, and the work of the female convicts was the slow, careful labour of needle and thread. She passed by the slow workings of the prison record into the long obscurity that the prisons of the age laid upon those who entered their gates. Where she was held, and for how long, and what at last became of her, the records do not now keep with any certainty. The trail goes cold somewhere in the long grey years of the late 70s, and there it is best perhaps to leave it. The young actress did not return for long to the stage of the St. James's. The repertoire of the French troupe ran on without her. Mr. Raphaelithalix took his company back to Paris at the end of the season, and the doors of the small theatre upon King Street closed upon the great velvet curtains, and the painted backdrops, and the soft yellow light of the foot-lamps. The young actress, by the slow motion of her life in the years that followed, married and bore a son, and lived out her days in Paris, where she died at last in 1921, an old lady of 74, in a quiet flat upon the Boulevard Pereire. Lord Lucan went on with the long evening of his life. He walked his measured walks in the parks of Mayfair. He sat at the long oak tables of his clubs in Pall Mall. He kept his small estates in Ireland. He received in the year before his death the Field Marshal's baton that crowned his long career. And he died at last, an old man of 88, in November of 1888, in his house in South Audley Street, the year of the great fogs and of certain other crimes in the East End that drew the eye of the world away from the older crimes of the West. The house at number 13 Park Lane stood empty for some little while, and then was let again to a new tenant, and then to another, and then to another. The brass knocker, shaped like a lion's head, was polished daily by a new housemaid. The fanlight above the door was lit each evening by the gas of a new chandelier. The small white dog of the household had been taken by the young actress with her to Paris and had not been replaced. The bells in the basement rang for new orders, in new tongues, from new families, and the long row of houses upon the eastern side of Park Lane went on, year after year, as it had always gone on. Now if a traveller stands today upon the eastern pavement of Park Lane, where it runs along the iron rails of Hyde Park, between the great arch of the Wellington Memorial at the south and the white marble arch at the north, the traveller will see a road that is not quite the road of 1872. The lane has been widened. The trees of the park have grown taller. The great row of small Victorian terraces upon the eastern side, where the foreign widows kept their houses and the bankers kept their houses and the dukes kept their houses, has, over the long course of the years that followed, been pulled down, in part, by the slow demands of the rising city, in part by the bombs of the Great War of the last century, and in part by the broader plans of the road widening of the 1960s. In the place of those small stone fronts today stand the tall fronts of the great hotels of the modern age. The Dorchester, the Grosvenor House, the Hilton, the Four Seasons, and the long blocks of the luxury flats whose windows, by night, look out across Hyde Park toward the lights of Knightsbridge. Of the small house at number 13, no stone now stands. The white painted steps are gone. The fanlight is gone. The brass knocker shaped like a lion's head is gone. The basement passage and the larder and the coal cellar and the small narrow pantry at the back are gone. The mews behind, where the carriage houses once stood, have been built over with the back walls of the great hotels, where, on a Sunday afternoon in April of 1872, the bells of the upper rooms hung in their ordered rows above the long deal table of a kitchen. There now runs the soft hum of the modern traffic upon a wide and busy road, and the cabs and the buses and the cars go up and down where the Victorian carriages once went up and down, and the lamps along the lane, no longer of gas now but of cool white electricity, burn each evening at the same slow careful hour as the lamps that came before them. The trees of Hyde Park across the road are the same trees, somewhat older. The riders of Rotten Row still go up and down the long sand drive, although there are fewer of them now. The swans of the Serpentine still drift in slow circles upon the still grey water. The bells of St. George's, Hanover Square, still ring on Sundays. The fog of London, by the slow workings of the cleaner air of the modern day, has long since lifted, and the sky above the rooftops is no longer the pale yellow sky of the gas lamps, but the cooler grey of an English city of cleaner laws and cleaner rivers. There is no plaque at the place. There is no small brass marker set into the wall. The passers-by who walk along the wide pavement, looking out across the park toward the trees, do not know what once stood there. The traffic moves on. The hotels stand silent behind their tall glass doors, and the wind, which once came across the iron rails of the park and shook the bare upper branches of the plane trees of the 1870s, comes today and shakes the same trees, a little taller, a little older, a little more carefully kept. Let her name, then, be set down here in the quiet of the small chapter, before the candle is at last put out. She was Marie Caroline Besson Riel of Paris, and afterward of Park Lane. She was the daughter of a small, careful family of trade. She was a milliner of the Rue Lafitte in her younger years. She was the wife of Jules Richard Riel and the mother of Caroline Julie. She was 46 years old. She kept a small white dog at her feet upon the hearth-rug. She kept her account-book in a small, tight hand. She came to London out of the long winter of the siege and the bloody week of the Commune, with such few things as she could carry, and she made what life she could in the foreign quarter of the foreign city. She died, by the cruel act of another, upon a Sunday in April, in the basement of her own house, in the year 1872. The candle burned low. The chamber fell silent, and history once again turned the page in the dark.